Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast of around 10 years of research into autistic Christians and ex-Christians, specifically focusing on ASD1. And on this podcast, we like to talk about all sorts of things related to autism, the politics of autism, autism and Christianity, autistic subcultures, and all those types of things. And this episode is going to be a sort of mix of all of those different topics, and we are going to be talking about a topic that I've sort of skirted around on this podcast several times. I've mentioned it in passing, or I've had discussions about it, but I've never really done a deep dive and gone in earnest into this topic, and so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about the question that is being asked an awful lot these days: should we split the autism spectrum? And I will try to give my most fair analysis that I think I can while asking this question. And to help me with that, I have brought returning guest Marie back to the podcast.
Hi, so I'm Marie. I'm autistic ASD1, and I have a brother with profound autism. He's been diagnosed with ASD3, and he was diagnosed when he was a very small child. And it's good to be back. Thank you for having me back, John.
Yeah, so if you want to listen to what I was told was one of my best episodes, you
Oh,
can
that's
you
so good
can
to hear.
go. Yeah, Marie was here for the talking about radical feminism and Christianity episode. I really enjoyed that, and I got a lot of positive feedback from that. So if you want to listen to a different episode on a much different topic than the one we'll be discussing today, you can also check that out. Yeah, so the first thing I thought I would do is sort of give people context into the history of autism. Marie, are you yourself familiar with the history at all?
Yes, I'm somewhat familiar, but I think you might be better able to give a summary here.
Yeah, sure. There are lots of different summaries. A lot of autistic people have read the book Neurotribes by Steve Silverman, and Steve gives a accounting of autism in that book, or an accounting of the development of the autism diagnosis that I will say he may have taken a few liberties with the historical record in that book. I won't try to go over that again, but his portrayal of it was very, I would say, slanted towards a certain narrative and retelling of autism. And he does a lot of like Hans Asperger apologia in it, where he pretends that
Oh
he was just a
no.
misunderstood guy who was,
Oh no, no,
just trying to
no.
help the poor autistics from not being eugenicized. That is not the case. And there are a few sort of historical and framing errors within that. So I thought, given that that is how most autistic people that I meet know about the history of autism, to try to give a more relevant depiction of it, I'll say. So this is going to be my attempt. So autism, we don't exactly have a first person who truly invented it. There are sort of three people who independently start to discover it in the 1920s, 1930s. These people are Hans Asperger, who was a Austrian guy living in Vienna. We have Leo Kanner, who was a Jewish guy, also living in Europe at the time. I believe also in Vienna. And he, however, was Jewish, so didn't stay in Vienna for very long, given the time period. And then we had a different person named Grunya Sukareva, who was a Soviet psychiatrist who also started doing work with autism, or what she started to call autism. And most notably, Sukareva also included girls in her earliest studies and focused on things like what we would now call ASD1 in girls and things like that. The exact founding isn't very important. It's really important to understand that also at the time, theories of autism were very heavily influenced by psychiatrists like Freud, who most people now would say may not have been acting on the most empirically sound methods for determining the things that he was saying. And so a lot of this early writing that you'll find about autism, as I have read and attempt to read, has a lot to do with psychoanalysis. They were thinking that it was tied to schizophrenia. All these people were basically starting to look at it. But what we know from autism is mostly what comes from a guy named Leo Kanner, who developed something called Kanner syndrome. And Kanner syndrome was thought to be a rare form of autism and is basically what we mostly know today as severe autism or profound autism or ASD3, whatever you want to call it. That being said, Kanner didn't just look at ASD3. He actually did look at ASD1, 2, and 3. Kanner came up with a lot of ideas, many of which he backtracked on. One of the famous ones was refrigerator mothers.
Oh,
And
yes.
I recently did a deep dive reading about refrigerator mothers, and I couldn't help but think, I actually think that refrigerator mothers, he was just describing women with ASD1, and
Yes, this is
that was all
something.
he was describing.
Yes,
Like
that is something which
I always joked about that.
I think your joke might actually be tracking reality here. Is
Yeah,
something
it
I
was
share that
something that
suspicion.
I always joked about, and then I actually started like reading what he was writing, and I was like, oh no, he found the undiagnosed autistic mothers of profoundly autistic children, and just misread what was going on there. He did, however, take that back later on in his career. That is mostly what we know. Like when people say autism or classic autism, they're mostly referring to Kanner syndrome. At the same time, we had a guy named Hans Asperger, who was, like I said, a clinical psychiatrist working out of Vienna. And he came up with the condition called Asperger syndrome. At the time, he didn't call it Asperger syndrome, he called it autistic psychopathy. And he described this as the absent-minded professor syndrome. And he had these descriptions of these mostly boys who presented as ASD1. Now, many people will read Asperger as a guy who was not a Nazi and not involved in the Nazi eugenics program or trying to save kids from the Nazi eugenics program. That is not what the historical record actually reflects when you look into it. The guy killed a lot of disabled children.
Yeah,
There isn't like a sanitized way to put that. Like
he signed
he
off on the
signed the death
deaths
warrants for.
of like over 100 disabled children, which is not something that one should rehabilitate in any way.
Yes, this is not a man who is out looking for the best interests of autistic people. Now, did he save some people with Asperger's from the T4 program? Maybe. However, like he also did kill a lot of people and did not seem to have any regrets about that, or really any looking back being like, oops, that was bad, shouldn't have done that. That's sort of what we get from that time period. It is a very dark period of autism history, and not one that, like you said, we should be trying to rehabilitate. So yeah, in most of autism was unknown for until like the 80s and 90s. Kanner syndrome was thought to be extremely rare. And this was also a sort of like, it was a big thing in psychiatry to find a very rare diagnosis. And it was something that people cared a lot about to, if you had a common thing, it was kind of like, whatever, who cares about that? And so a lot of Kanner syndrome was artificially suppressed, the numbers. So there were lots of parents who were like, okay, something's wrong with my kid. What am I supposed to do with them? Do they have Kanner syndrome? And he'd be like, no, they don't have Kanner syndrome. They have some other intellectual disability or something like that. And so, for the most part, Kanner syndrome was not well known. It wasn't until the sort of late 80s, early 90s that the parents of these children started to self-organize. And this is also when the internet started to become a thing, and a lot of the early organizing was actually done over the internet and over internet message boards, because autism doesn't really cluster in places. It is mostly spread out around the general population, and so it's often
I will
quite
say,
hard to find other parents who have children with ASD3. And also, it's just logistically hard to meet other parents and families with ASD3, because just having a child with profound autism makes it hard for you to leave your house sometimes. And so a lot of this early organizing was done over the internet. Did you have anything to add?
oh, just that I will say that it is, to add to the theory of ASD1 parents or broad autism phenotype parents with profoundly autistic family members, is that these be early adopters of the internet and computers.
Yes. Autism has a very strong genetic component, and it should therefore be no surprise that the parents of autistic children were some of the earliest adopters of the internet. This is, I do not think, a coincidence. This is one of those things. There were a lot of conferences that started, but there was one particular conference that is relevant to this history, which was in 1992. So in 1990, or sorry, the conference was in 1993, but a year previous, in 1992, the Autistic Network International was founded by three autistic adults named Jim Sinclair, Kathy Grant, and Donna Williams. This was the first ever autism self-advocacy organization, and these were people who were diagnosed with autism as children and who had now grown up and were adults. It is important to note that these grown up adults were not profoundly autistic. They were all speaking, they all had, IQ greater than 90. They were what we would now call ASD1, or at the time, what they called high functioning autism. In 1993, there was a big conference, and these conferences would draw in the parents of autistic children. And at one of these conferences, Jim Sinclair gave a speech. And the speech was called Don't Mourn for Us. It's a very famous speech. You can go and you can find it on the internet if you would like. This is one that gets talked about as a sort of inflection point in autism self advocacy. And it also gets sort of bitterly brought up by the parents of profoundly autistic children as also of an inflection point where things for them started to go poorly, I guess. In this speech, Sinclair argued that the grief of parents that they often feel upon learning their child is autistic is not about the autistic child's actual needs or experiences, but about the sort of loss of having a normal child that they had hoped for. And he called for autism societies and support groups to focus on understanding and supporting the autistic people that are in their family as they are, rather than mourning for what they are not. And that was the whole sort of idea of his speech. It was seen as a huge win for autism self-advocates. It is often characterized now as the start of the bad times by a lot of autism parents. Do you know why that is? Like, are you able? I don't know. We can cut this part out. Can you explain why maybe people would have that reaction to his speech?
Sure. So the few ones would be that, um, I mean, I think the idea that I think he very cavalierly, perhaps too cavalier, with saying just about the speech and then the beginnings of the neurodiversity movement in general. I guess I can get that a bit later after this. In terms of the speech, he says, and for people which what we refer to now as people with higher support needs or profound autism, they may not be able to leave their houses or live independently, and they may require full-time care, but that's not, and they should be supported. But that's not really something to be mourned. He refers to this very cavalierly, and when you're talking about a person who might have to be for whom like they'll either need a primary caregiver or they might have to be institutionalized, which, as a family member with profound autism, I'm like, my family was very lucky in terms of we were able to get on really well. Like my dad is, economically quite successful. We were able to get on well with like my mom staying home to take care of my brother. But this is not the case for most parents, people with profound autism. For most families, this is what happens to the kid, a profoundly autistic kid who is unable to survive by themselves, who would essentially die if they're left, alone. What happens after the parents die? What happens then? These are all things which, to say, real concrete worries that to kind of wave away so cavalierly. I understand why parents of profoundly autistic people got annoyed with this. Um, that is to say, I do think it is sort of psychologically helpful for parents of profoundly autistic people to perhaps not focus on what might have been with my own parents. I have seen sometimes they're like, look at my brother's odd behavior and like look at each other and say, oh, I wish he wouldn't be like that. And this is not to say they don't have a lot of love for him. They absolutely do. It's just, I understand that they had hopes that my brother wouldn't spend, 7 hours walking around the perimeter of our yard while like humming to himself. I understand that they wish that, or many times it's when he's in severe distress and cannot communicate to us what is causing that distress. And so I want to, but so like, but that's so, but I don't think in terms of like dwelling on that or like meditating on what might have been is actually like very psychologically helpful also for the parent either. So I will say that I've never really done that with, as far as my brother is concerned, because we're quite close in age. So I was so young that, I mean, to me, he's always just kind of been Joseph, but I didn't really have kind of the concept of what otherwise I think would have been when this kind of all started.
Yeah, and generally speaking, this is seen. It was seen as tone deaf. It was seen as a speech that really wasn't taking seriously people's concerns, and it was being very dismissive. The next big thing to happen was that in 1994, Asperger syndrome was officially made a diagnosis. So Asperger syndrome became a thing. It was a British psychologist who was reading through German papers and came across Asperger's papers and thought, oh, this is a thing that I'm seeing in my practice. I think this would be a good thing to rediscover. And it was named Asperger's syndrome after Hans Asperger, whose notes she was reading, and who basically she read the notes and went, oh, yeah, I know exactly what this is. And Asperger's became a diagnosis. It is important to note Asperger's was always part of the autism spectrum. A lot of people think Asperger's was never autism. It was always thought of within the same family of neurodevelopmental disorders. No one thought it was profound autism, but they did think, yep, this is somewhat related. And it has pretty much always been the case. Since Asperger discovered it, since Sukareva discovered it, since Connor discovered it, wherever you have this type of disorder, it's always been considered somewhere autism related or somewhere autism adjacent. And so that this is where it sort of officially came into being and how it officially came into being. It was initially thought to mostly only affect boys, and so the diagnoses were heavily skewed on boys. Most of the ideas of what Asperger's was were typed on boys, and so it was thought this is like a very rare thing for girls to have, maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 10. The estimates that you get from reading historical documentation from this time of how many girls, like some are 1 in 100 in some papers that you'll find. But anyway, this was thought to be a male disorder primarily. In this is basically how it went. ANI, which is the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, again, most of them were meeting online and maybe doing a few meetups here and there. It was not a particularly large community because autism diagnosis was still quite rare at that point, and the only people in ANI were people who had the sort of high-functioning variant of autism. But now Asperger's came into the mix, and people started getting diagnosed with Asperger's, and this was sort of increasing that population. It was increasing so much that in 2004, a guy named Alex Plank and Dan Grover created a site which I spent an embarrassing amount of time on in high school called Wrong Planet. Wrongplanet.net. It was a early autism forum, and it was the only place that I felt I had a home for a very long time. And so I owe these two men a big thank you for saving my sanity when I was 16 and my mother told me that I probably had autism, and I freaked out and then went online to Google what is, or she said, I always thought you had Asperger's. I freaked out. I went and checked. And then, yeah, when I brought it up with a school counselor who was actually a specialist in this, he said, you are the most typical case of Asperger syndrome I've ever seen. And we went through a whole discussion of should I get diagnosed? Should I not get diagnosed? And eventually he said, no, don't get diagnosed because it'll go on your medical records and you want to join the army. But anyway, Wrong Planet became the one of the central hubs for autism self-advocacy, where a bunch of people, mostly with Asperger's, but at the time it was Asperger's, high-functioning autism, and PDD-NOS, which were essentially the same thing. All these people were gathering and congregating on Wrong Planet, and Wrong Planet gets its name from the very common autistic experience that you feel like you are an alien that looks like a human being that has landed on the wrong planet. So you are actually an alien species from a different planet, and you just so happen to be on this Earth, and you have to feel like you need to blend in with all the other human-looking things. And yeah, it was a huge generator of autism self-identity, and you basically can't understand the modern neurodiversity movement without understanding places like Wrong Planet. There were lots of other forums with autistic people on them in the early 2000s. I mean, like, as you said, early adopters of the internet, and sort of enthusiastic early adopters of the internet. And so there were many places where we congregated, but yeah.
This is a bit sad, but I think it's relevant. Late 2000s, late aughts, early 2010s. So autism can present differently. ASD1 can present differently in girls. There is an ecosystem of pro eating disorder content online, which is now migrated mostly to Twitter. Unfortunately, that's pretty public, so I don't feel too bad sharing that. But there were less so now, but there was an entire ecosystem of people online who were participating in that community, which is much smaller now, thank goodness, or it seems smaller now. If I had to take a guess, I would place money. I would bet that this was populated by autistic girls.
Oh, no one would take that. No sane person knowing about autism would take that bet with you. Right? Like that.
Yeah. I mean, it was also populated with older male fetishists, but that's not some,
yes.
But that's a whole other very sort of sad conversation anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So Tumblr was a large site of it. And yeah, that's a topic for a whole other podcast that I could go on. But as someone who started to look at autism communities online in 2014, I learned many things about how to optimize your eating disorder and tips on how to hide it from your family and all sorts of fun things like that. Sad. Yeah, lots of that. Anyway, 2005, an organization called Autism Speaks was founded. Autism Speaks is sort of the boogeyman in a lot of autism advocacy spaces, I guess. You say Autism Speaks, they go, for many reasons, some of them good, some of them not. But Autism Speaks was basically founded by the parents of autistic children who were like, we need to do something about this. we need something because no one's doing anything for us. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Let's get someone to pay attention to us, and let's do that by doing what all these other NGOs have been doing. And so they started Autism Speaks, and Autism Speaks, they initially were founded to cure autism. That was their goal. And they put out a lot of things. They have a very famous commercial that's like, autism is gonna come and steal your child and make things sad and cause you to divorce and stuff. And it was very fear-mongery and very scaremongering and gets criticized a lot. But anyway, they have since pivoted to very different ways of approaching autism, but still very focused on profound autism and ASD3. And that was basically Autism Speaks. And then in 2006, ASAN was founded. ASAN is going to be the topic of much discussion in upcoming minutes of this podcast. ASAN is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. ASAN was founded to allow autistic people to advocate for themselves up and against the other paradigm, which is the parents of autistic children advocating for them. And so the idea of ASAN is we don't need the parents to advocate for us, we need us to advocate for us. And in 2013, the DSM-5 drops. And the DSM-5 is extremely controversial in the communities of people with family members who have ASD3, mostly because in 2013, autism went away, Asperger's went away, PDD-NOS went away, high-functioning autism went away. It all went away and got replaced with autism spectrum disorder. The criteria for autism expanded greatly. It merged all the different types of autism into one diagnosis, and we are now dealing with that 12 years later. And yeah, that is basically the timeline of important events in this autism history trajectory. ASAN was pretty important in making this happen. ASAN wasn't the only reason, but they are pretty big there. So I think the first question is like, why were the diagnoses merged together? And I think first you need to understand what ASAN is and who ASAN are. I will say I used to be a very big ASAN guy. I used to be on the forums. I used to be doing the stuff. I would go to meetups. I was an enthusiastic worker bee who recruited other autistics into the cause. This was a big deal for me, and it was a big thing that I participated in and took a lot of pride in participating in. ASAN is a social model first autism self-advocacy organization. I think that's the first important thing to note. And the other next important characteristic to note is that despite what they will say, they are mostly representatives of autistic people with low support needs. So ASD1. Now, I say that, and the first thing that an ASAN member is going to say is, no, we're not. We're advocating for all autistics across the spectrum, no matter how profound, no matter how affected they are. And they will point to some examples. However, if you just look at the people actually doing the work, actually involved in it, actually moving things forward, it's all low support needs people, or at least it's low support needs people at a ratio of like 19-1. It is.
Yeah, I struggle to see how someone with high support needs like my brother, whom in terms of I think the only way we like in terms of advocacy for himself that he does is I remember we were visiting a natural history museum and we were walking out and he saw a toy in the gift shop and he like peeled off and ran away to the gift shop and like just looked at the toy and looked at my dad and said, I want this toy, which we bought for him because like for spontaneous speech like that is quite rare. And it was sort of a good moment. And so my brother he's memorized his address and my parents' phone number and his name and name, street address, all that stuff, so that like in case like getting lost, he now has like a watch that he wears because my poor mom is like she's terrified of him getting lost. I think she once saw a news story about a profoundly autistic man who was lost for over a year, and my mom can't talk about that story without crying. She gets very upset. I understand why she gets very upset. It'd be very scary. So my brother now wears a watch to know where he is. But But it's very difficult to see how somebody like my brother could plausibly move things forward or advocate for himself or others, really. I just don't see how that
Yeah,
is possible.
the reality is he can't. Like it's just what it is. Now, people in ASAN will say you are presuming incompetence. This is incorrect. You're not presuming incompetence. There is no presumption here. It is just a sort of fact of reality. A lot of them do advocate. Now, not all of them. Some of them will say, look, if you employ methods like facilitated communication, they can use facilitated communication to advocate for themselves. Look at all these people. We'll talk about facilitated communication in a little bit. This is
I,
generally speaking
I will
not
also
a way that people actually effectively communicate. It has not been verified in double blind experiments, which are the crucial ones that you need to verify that this is actually working.
on the presumed competence, I think that it's bad to presume incompetence. However, like I will also say, my brother has oddly taught himself some things. He taught himself how to swim, so he actually, if there's a pool, like he doesn't need supervision like swimming because he can like swim very well. He bikes around the neighborhood and he can do that without supervision because like he knows like he knows not to like bike in front of a car and stuff like that. So the idea that these I just find the presumption I actually find the presumption that like loved ones are in some kind of like Munchausen's by proxy way,
Yeah,
like imposing these things on their loved ones. I find an odd thing to believe.
it is odd. I always say the opposite of presume incompetence is not presume competence, or the opposite of presume competence is not presume incompetence. The opposite is don't presume incompetence or don't presume competence. In a lot of I think that's a necessary distinction because in a lot of these cases, you can just do evaluations, right? You should not you should not assume that someone can't do anything and that they're always going to be like that and it's always going to be bad. But at the same time, you shouldn't assume that they can do everything that everyone else can. It isn't a helpful thing for them. The presumption of competence is a very good metric, I think, and a very useful metric for disabilities because a lot of people that we thought were incompetent before, like people with cerebral palsy, for example, we presumed incompetence. And they were actually very competent. They all had, well, I mean, a lot of them had very functional minds and could do all the tasks, like all the cognitive tasks that a able-bodied person could do. And so presuming incompetence was absolutely a bad thing to do in those cases because they have a motor function disorder. However, sometimes people don't have just motor functional disorders. Sometimes they do have cognitive disorders that prevent them from being able to abstract reason, right? So an example that I have given in the past is I've talked to people with profound autism and they can't conceptualize that they live in a city. Like they don't know what a city is. And if you don't know what a city is, and if you don't know that you live in a city, which is in a state, which is in a country, how are you supposed to tell someone where you want to live if you don't know that you're in a city or what a city is or that there are other cities and these cities are different and they're like connected by roads or by airways and things like that? It is not right to presume that that person has the ability to advocate for themselves with respect to like where they want to live or something like that. Just as it is unfair to assume that a person can't make that decision, it's also unfair to assume a person can make that decision when they can't. Anyway, that this long tangent aside, the ASAN made a major push. ASAN is founded by a guy named Ari Neiman. Ari Neiman was appointed by Obama in 2009 to the National Council on Disability. ASAN, when the DSM was being revitalized in 2013, they submitted policy briefs. They were listed as an advisor of the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Working Group. They participated in comments periods on the DSM. They were engaged in the DSM revision working group. ASAN, just undeniably, uncontroversially, by their own like self-promotion, were a major influencing factor in the DSM and in the merging diagnoses. This isn't me saying it's a bad thing they did this. This is a normal thing that you would expect, right? ASAN is a policy lobbying group that lobbies mostly on the behalf of people with low support needs in order to help them. Of course, they had a vested interest in doing this. They did have a vested interest in doing this, and they were influential in making this decision. A lot of people say, and that's a bad thing, and a lot of other people say, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying either. I'm just saying this is a simple matter of fact that they were involved in this and they had an effect. There are 2 policy briefs that they put out, which I will link in the show notes. You can read through them. I don't think there's a good reason for me to read through them on the podcast. I think these are basically the best documents that you can find for going through a thorough explanation as to why the diagnoses were merged. I should caveat, ASAN is not the only reason that the diagnoses were merged. They are just a very large reason, and they're the most visible one, and they're the easiest one to point to and to say, read these documents, go through these papers, you will learn why people wanted the diagnoses to be merged. In terms of like the pro-merge side, ASAN is probably the best resource. Like I said, I was a very big ASAN guy. ASAN was very important to me, I will say. Just personally, it meant a lot to me. It was very important for my development. I was incredibly enthusiastically involved from around 2009 to 2016. Again, I wasn't anyone important within ASAN. I was just a guy, and I would meet up with other guys and do autism things. And the vast majority of things I did were on my local level, wherever I could find them. I did a lot of volunteering. I did a lot of mentoring with teenagers and things like that. And yeah, ASAN was not only necessary for me, it was necessary for a lot of people with ASD1. ASAN was developed because there was a need. The situation for people with ASD1 or the low support needs side of the autism spectrum that we were dealing with in the 90s and 2000s was bleak. I cannot emphasize to you how bad it was in those days. So like for me, when I was sort of officially unofficially diagnosed, the reason that I was not officially diagnosed was there was nothing for me, right? There was literally nothing that a diagnosis would do. It was basically like, congrats, here's the thing you know about yourself now. Hope that gives you some peace of mind. And that was literally it, right?
Yeah.
So if you go, oh, there's this thing about me, I think I might actually need like supports, good luck, right? Like, it's like, look, someone kicks you into the deep end and is like, by the way, you're in the deep end. It's about 12 feet deep. Hope you don't drown. and it's like, I'm glad I know the deep end is 12 feet deep, because this can allow me to plan a better way to not drown as quickly. But this really isn't very helpful. Thank you for the information. But
Yeah.
please, I'm drowning. What am I supposed to do? Like, low support needs, I say low support needs, and a lot of people immediately in their head go, no support needs, or you're fine. Or like, relatively speaking, you're not as bad as someone with ASD3. That is true. Relatively speaking, I'm not. But low support needs, crucially, does not mean no support needs. It means we need support, but we need a low amount of it at a frequency and intensity that is relatively small compared to people with higher support needs.
I will say, and I know this has been something that you've talked about, and I do think this is that You've mentioned that you think a lot of the things on the internet or you see from ASD1 people or ASD people with autism with low support needs posting about how pretty much their autism, the only drawback, it's basically just it's a quirky personality that otherwise like should be completely socially adjusted, and it's not like in some ways it's the kind of thing of which like it actually has no serious drawbacks and yet you still have support needs, which doesn't make any sense
Yeah.
if you think about it. And
Yeah.
you said that you think essentially this is cope, and I do somewhat agree with you. I think that people like there are people with ASD1 do have serious difficulties and face serious problems, and to minimize that is bad. I do agree that it's someone who is like persistently underemployed for education, maybe dealing with a substance abuse problem. Those aren't things that they're going to post about on the internet. They're going to post about what they love posting about, which is their special interest.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that is why I think so much of the things on the internet are like memes about special interests, because like that's what's fun to talk about. It's fun to talk about your
Yes.
hobby, and like it's fun for me to talk about like the Sherman tank that my sisters got me for Christmas because I was boring them during family phone calls with like tank lore. But
Oh
essentially
my God, we are the same person.
okay, what's kind of funny is that like this wasn't necessarily even a special interest of mine. I just kind of like listened to a podcast and read one book. My family is so hair trigger, like, oh, this is the next thing. They immediately it's very sweet. It's very nice. Anyway, okay, I'm not gonna talk about tanks now, though I kind of want to. Anyway, so people are
We
gonna
need to resist. We need to get back on topic. The
yeah,
Sherman tank
exactly.
lore can wait till another episode. We can do an episode on Sherman tanks. I'm well equipped to do that. Don't worry. We'll have you back.
Although in all seriousness, I'm actually not a treadhead. There's some people for whom you could probably stick them into like any tank like World War II era tank blindfolded, and they'd be able just from touch be able to tell like what tank it is, etc., and like where things are. I am nowhere
Just
near
from the
that.
smell of the paint, they'd be
Yeah,
like, ah,
exactly.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm very much like how there are levels. We're arguing for levels in the ASD community. There are levels in the
Yes.
treadhead community as well.
Hey, everyone. If you're enjoying this podcast and want to support my work, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you're listening on YouTube, or rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app you listen to it on. Some people have asked me if they can support my research work and podcast or encourage me to continue doing this work that many autistic people find valuable. If my work has been helpful for you and you have the means to do so, I would appreciate if you could make a single donation or sign up for reoccurring monthly donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. I'll provide a link in the description. This is a very effective charity that helps prevent malaria by donating bed nets to people who need them. Each net costs around $2 and lasts for 3 to 4 years and protects on average 2 people. The statistics on this are well known. Every 600 nets that are provided saves 1 child from dying of malaria, and around 500 to 1,000 cases of malaria get prevented. Every single net matters. Even if you can only make a small donation, I would greatly appreciate it, as it really helps motivate me. So far, we've already raised well over $500, and I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. This does make a difference, and this really does help me want to continue pursuing this work. In addition, this podcast has merch. We use Teespring as a provider. I can provide a link in the description. There you can find many fun stickers that have themes that come up in this podcast, shirts, or mugs. Any of the proceeds from the merch will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and shared with the artists. That's all for now. Back to the podcast. Yeah.
Anyway, to what was I saying? Oh, right. The idea that like I also think there is a book actually which you recommended to me about it's from 2006, and I think it's from about Asperger's, and I was really struck by like the first, it's like a 400-page book, let's say, I don't remember exactly, the first 350 pages or 320 pages are like this is all the ways that having Asperger's affects your life. And it's really bad. It's really, really bad. It's all these really sad and heavy things, which, like, it's a very depressing read. And then you get to the end, and he's like, the line that struck me is, he's like, when I diagnose someone with Asperger's, I say, congratulations. And and part of it is that, like, this is really
It
sad.
is a very funny line, given the first section of the book is just like sadness, depression.
Yeah,
Everything's going to be
exactly.
terrible. You're going to be socially isolated. Congratulations, you have Asperger's. Oh no.
It's like you're
Yeah,
going to
the
be
exact same thought.
underemployed
Yeah.
and maybe suicidal, and also your partner might leave you.
Yeah.
Like, okay. Anyway, but congrats. But the thing is that, like, it's just true that, it's like, this is really sad to say, but it's just true to acknowledge that, like, people with ASD1 have elevated rates of depression, elevated rates of anxiety, elevated rates of other mental health issues, and have I've had, like, a lot of trouble accepting themselves, and, like, being able to, like, tackle this and, like, accept this about themselves. I also think too, part of my autism is actually really good, or, this kind of happier face is actually, in some ways, I'm thinking, perhaps even promoted by clinicians, not just advocates, because it's viewed as a way of helping people deal with the very real, like, sad, with people with ASD1, the very, like, real and sad struggles they have.
Look, when I mentored teenagers, I was super pro autism. I was like, it's the best. You have a brain that's going to make you an awesome computer engineer. It's going to be great. Let's teach you how to code. Like all these things, because talking about the actual reality of it to a 12-year-old, to be like, okay, I'm chronically depressed and I have been since I was about your age. That's not something you want to emphasize, right? You want to emphasize the positives. You want to talk about the good things, because the crushing reality that it's like, congrats, you're in the contingent that has a wildly elevated risk of suicide, isn't something that you really want to communicate or convey. And so a lot of this is literally cope, but it's cope for a good reason, I would say. Like, I would not say we're all coping, right? This is just like a cope train all the way down. And there are different ways of coping. And one of the ways of coping is keeping a positive attitude. And so, like, while I do push back on a lot of the, like, yay autism, yay neurodiversity stuff, I do think there is a place for that. And I especially think there's a place for that for teenagers and children. I think that is the appropriate way to deal with autism for that stage of cognitive development. You're in high school, you are the weird kid. Like, your bullies didn't need you to be diagnosed with Asperger's for them to know that you were a weird freak. Like, they identified that as soon as you walked into the classroom.
You've seen
um
the meme, right? Why
yeah.
is it so hard for clinicians to diagnose autism when seventh grade bullies can do it so easily?
Exactly, exactly. No, like, this is just the reality of it, right? That, I don't know, it's just, it is better for that developmental age to have a positive view of what's going on. And then when you're in your 20s, you're allowed to black pill a bit, or um well, maybe not, I don't know.
I would much
That's
rather an autistic girl make, like, really cringy memes and post them to, like, online on Reddit than go down the eating disorder Tumblr rabbit
Yeah.
hole.
Yeah, it is infinitely preferable for you to be cringe than for you to self-harm.
Yeah.
And so if that's what you need to cope, go for it, buddy. I'm in your camp if that's what you need. But, like, all of this is to say, like, so an example I often use is, like, what's a low support need? Needing glasses, right? If you don't have glasses, let's say you have a pretty strong prescription, you can't really see much. Now, glasses are not intensive support. However, you need them. And when you don't have them, holy crap, your life is miserable. You're going to crash your car into a tree because you can't see things, right? And so this isn't to say you need your glasses. You need that support. That doesn't mean you're fine. Like when you're wearing those glasses and when you have those glasses, you are fine, right? But if you don't have that support, it's going to be hard. And the reality is, a whole lot of us did not get that support. And so I talked to lots of people who were diagnosed early and lots of people who were diagnosed late. Here are some differences. Late diagnosed people, much more prone to substance abuse, much more prone to eating disorders, much more prone to having really bad anxiety, much more prone to burnout, much more prone to basically everything, like every negative coping mechanism that you can think. Hard drugs, alcohol, video game addiction, you name it, it's in there. And it's in there at much higher rates of people who weren't diagnosed because they needed a support and they didn't get it. And so they have to cope their way through it. And so, like, the ASAN people had extremely legitimate gripes and very valid critiques. Like, Ari Neiman himself has a very legitimate gripe and a very legitimate critique. So his story is he was put in a special needs school where he was basically, like, he graduated from Harvard eventually, but early on he was put in a special needs school where he was not treated appropriately for his developmental age. He was treated like he was incompetent, like he couldn't do math and couldn't do lots of things like that. He was not grouped with developmentally appropriate peers, and he was treated very poorly by the special ed system. And they assumed that because he had the diagnosis of autism, that he basically had no future and no potential. But with the right supports and with his own self-advocacy, he was able to get to a place where he could start going to a school that was developmentally appropriate and that did properly align with his actual needs. And he eventually went to Harvard, right? Like, that's a good thing. And so when he looks at the world, he's thinking about how many other Ari Neimans are there out there who are languishing in these special ed programs that don't see his potential and just see him as this poor, autistic boy with nothing going for him. And then how many other people out there need a diagnosis but don't get one and instead end up coping by developing a drinking problem or by, going on eating disorder Twitter and being like, wow, I love Thinspo or whatever the hell, right? Like, he doesn't have a unique story. This is common. This is very common around autistic people. And a lot of us were very poorly treated and underestimated and mishandled. Guys like Ari and the people who were involved in ASAN were legitimate victims of mistreatment and mismanagement and misclassification, and they were underserved. And I cannot emphasize enough, just because we are 15 years after the fact, I knew what it was like in 2010, and I knew a whole bunch of people who were in the autism system between the 2000 and 2010. It was not great. there wasn't a lot for us, and a lot of us basically got tossed in the crushing machine and did not come out the other side very well. This mistreatment and mismanagement that a lot of us faced, like myself included, fed into ASAN and the way that ASAN did self-advocacy. So again, when you see all these very legitimate problems that you're facing, what are you going to do? And a whole bunch of people who are just like you, who have the same problems as you do, hitting the same barriers. You're going to go, look, these are barriers for people like me. We need to eliminate them for us. I legitimately thought at the time, okay, we have all these people who are exactly like me being mishandled, misled, and their potentials are being snuffed out too early. What can we do? And I saw ASAN as the solution. And these perspectives aren't just coming out of nowhere. It's not like, this is not data-driven or anything like that. These perspectives are informed by the lived experience of people who were in the trenches. And to many of us, this was a justice issue. It was making our lives miserable. And it was something we didn't actually want to live with. And so the solution that a lot of us saw at the time, and I was here when it was happening. I remember not really getting it, right? Like, I remember when we were talking about merging the diagnosis, I was like, okay, but why? um, that was just me at the time. When we merged it, I was like, okay, cool. I have autism now instead of Asperger's. No big deal to me. I guess this is the new word that we're using. That was pretty much mine. But merging was seen as a very important goal for the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. Again, you can read their full position papers. They are very thorough. I will summarize them as best I can here, but like, if you actually want to know, read the actual papers. They go through case studies, they cover stuff. There's a lot of specific policy stuff in those papers that like is really specific to the US and US educational systems, which might not make sense if you're in like the UK or Canada. Like, I remember reading it and going like, ooh, you guys don't have universal health care. Okay. Forgot about that. That is a problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like the ADA and how the ADA functions and who gets classified as what disability. There's lots of stuff in there like that. I'm not going to talk about those policy specifics. I'm going to try basically summarize their broad argument. And so basically their broad argument for why we should merge has 4 pieces. 1, the first is to reduce semantic and category confusion. 2, avoid edge cases and what I call the sorting problem. 3, increase support and access to support services to everyone who is on the autism spectrum. And 4, expand or loosen the diagnostic criteria to account for socialization differences and underdiagnosis in marginalized communities. These are all very real problems, and these are all very real problems that get solved by merging the diagnosis. So the first one is semantic and category confusion. So we used to have 3 different categories. For one was called autism disorder, one was called Asperger syndrome, and one was called PDD-NOS. And within PDD-NOS, there were other subcategories. One was called atypical autism, which I just find funny. Atypical autism, if you read the description, it's just like autism, but you're a girl. I always found that one funny. PDD-NOS was basically like, okay, so you're definitely a bit spurgy, but you don't meet all of the criteria. Like, Asperger's had, you have to meet all these criteria, and autism was like, you have to meet all these criteria. But what if you needed 4 points in one category, but you only have 3? Like, what do we do with you? And the solution was PDD-NOS. So PDD-NOS was, you're spurgy, but not quite enough for us.
I
And
remember reading something, a paper. I'll try to find it after this. It's from like around this era, and they were talking about the differences between PDD and OS, HFA, and Asperger's, and they noted that people with like children with Asperger's spoke very pedantically and used very old-fashioned words and language and had old-fashioned modes of like address and things, which was very like, it was just very funny to me that like, really, this is the criteria you're using their
that is so true, though.
vocabulary.
Like, if you talk to autistic people, one of the parts of the autism accent that you can pick up on is just the use of weird archaic vocabulary.
Yeah.
That's Here's the thing, though. That's mostly in people who are avid readers. You don't typically find
Mm-hmm.
that in autistic people who aren't. And so that did end up as like a filtering thing, which is like a legitimate thing to bring up, because like, okay, we were going to diagnose you with Asperger's, but you're not using enough archaic Elizabethan English. Like,
No, exactly. That's
really?
why. Yeah, that's why. I
Yeah,
mean, I remember my mother telling me when I was a child that like you can't really use the word ejaculated, which is used in like 19th century literature as like, oh, like to say aloud with a lot of gusto, but is not really used in that context anymore.
so true. So true. Many people are saying this. Yes. So basically, what you actually ended up with functionally. So the only actual measurable difference between high functioning autism and or mild autism and Asperger syndrome was that high functioning autism had a speech delay. That is it. That was the differentiating factor. Did you have a speech delay as a child? When you got to adulthood, there was no difference between people with Asperger's and people with high functioning autism. I actually talked to clinicians at the time. Sorry, I talked to clinicians who were working at the time. I didn't talk to them at the time. But I talked to some older clinician friends of mine who were back in the day, and they basically told me if you got a room of 600 people, 200 of them high functioning autism, 200 of them Asperger's, and 200 PDD NOS, and you ask clinicians to accurately diagnose them, you would have about as much success accurately differentiating them from each other as you would if you just like built a random number generator and stuck a 1, 2, or 3 on random people. Like that is about as clinically meaningful as this distinction was, that it could be functionally, it could, a random number generator could do the same job as diagnosing these people. PDD NOS or Asperger's, basically the difference between them was often like, are you good at masking? Like, how good at hiding your autism are you? And like how severely bullied were you in high school to learn to hide your accent and your archaic vocabulary, right? Like like did you say ejaculate in grade 7 and then get attacked by everyone calling you a weirdo, so you learned, oh, I shouldn't say that, you know?
Yeah, pretty much.
um,
I was
and
homeschooled. The filter was my parents and also my older sister, who is not autistic and is actually very social. So
yes. So,
she was, I say this very affectionately and with love, Helen, in case you're listening to this, she was my bully. But
yep, my older brother was too. And I mean, I do not hold anything against him. He was also a child when I was a child.
yes, and I
um,
same goes for my sister.
however, I think back to it and I'm like, man, I deserved everything I got from it. I think back to like the things I did. So I was so socially confused. Like I knew something was wrong with me at like age 12. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with me though. But I looked at my older brother. I'm like, he doesn't have any of the problems I do. What am I supposed to do? And so I'm like, I'm just going to copy everything that he does. And imagine like, imagine you are a normal kid and your spurgy ass brother, 2 years younger than you, is trying to imitate everything
Oh
you do.
no.
Like, imagine how well you would respond to that as like as a 14-year-old, that and your 12-year-old weird awkward brother
Oh
does
no, no,
literally
no.
everything you're doing. It doesn't go well. Anyway, Peter, if you ever listen to this, you were probably justified. I deserved a lot of that. Anyway, but like that was basically it, right? There was no functional difference between these categories. And so, you had a lot of other weird ideas, like, the Wikipedia entry for Asperger's. I remember reading it when my mother first suggested that I might have it. And it had a section that said, most people grow out of it after age 18. And it's like, that's not true.
That's not, I
but
mean, I
uh,
wish.
but the perception was that you grew out of it as you got older. That's not what happened. You just got better at hiding it. Also, all the supports were also for children at this time. And autistic adults were like, hey, just because I turned 18 doesn't mean I turned invisible. Like, I'm still here and I still have all my problems. What am I supposed to do? Anyway, there's no point in having these three categories. They're all the same thing. Like, functionally, there is no meaningful difference between these other than like basic aesthetics. The only real difference, talking to my clinician friends at the time, between these were, one, you had the speech delay, but if you didn't have the speech delay, whether you got Asperger's or PDD NOS was basically clinician preference and the clinician's observable bias. This isn't quite the case in every kind. Like, if you had Asperger's and you couldn't mask to save your life, you probably wouldn't get PDD NOS. You'd probably get Asperger's. But for a lot of us, PDD NOS and Asperger's was basically like clinician preference. But Asperger's was a different disability category than PDD NOS in some states and in some provinces. And so the difference between PDD-NOS and Asperger's might be the difference between you getting into social housing, or you getting assigned a social worker, or you getting access to disability programs or disability aids. Not that there was much, but if there was, you might not get it because your clinician thought you were more PDD-NOS-y than you were Asperger-y because you made a little more eye contact than he would have liked, right? Like this is basically what it was, and that sucks. That sucks if you get diagnosed in a different category and you get denied disability services, or there are healthcare implications or insurance implications because you got basically a subjective diagnosis. This is a problem. And so, like, the merge was like, okay, look, we can solve this problem very easily and it just makes sense. So let's do that. The second problem is what I call edge case sorting. So, edge case sorting is like, this is a classic problem in academia. So you have the lumpers and the splitters, the people who when you're categorizing something, want to lump everything together, and the people who want to split them all into discrete categories. This is a problem in the lumper versus splitter debate. Autism from ASD1 and ASD3 is related, right? Like, this really isn't a question that's up for scientific debate. They are neurodevelopmental disorders that are linked. There
Yeah,
is,
that's my one kind of the one sort of thing which I do kind of worry about in terms of the argument for splitting the spectrum, which I do agree with in terms of saying that, like, these are they're scientific related, but they present in such different ways that lumping them all together is perhaps maybe the wrong choice. One thing that kind of holds me back is that scientifically it does very much seem that these disorders are very, very much, that these presentations are extremely linked. And also I think it might cause confusion if it's like, as like the Catholic Church for a long time maintained like the index of forbidden books, but like anyone can read studies and journals, and it might cause confusion as well if there's like a scientific standard and like a layperson standard.
yeah,
Anyway.
yeah, and there's a sort of larger problem where we always talk about ASD1 and ASD3, but there's this middle ground, ASD2. And I know quite a few people with ASD2. I have met quite a few people with ASD2 and the families of people with ASD2. And here's the thing, there is a very ambiguous and porous border between ASD1 and ASD2. Where does ASD1 start and where does ASD2 start? Where does ASD3 start and where does ASD2 start? Like, where on the continuum are you going to split this baby? Because it's a genuinely hard question. I wish we
Yeah.
could just like do a genetic test and be like, oh, you have all the ASD2 genes and you have the ASD3 ones, or like something like that. But there isn't anything like that. We can't put you in an fMRI and go, okay, your brain lit up like this, you're 2. Your brain lit up like that, you're 1. This is a fluid continuum. And there is basically a gradation of autism all across this continuum. It's also not a linear continuum, right? It's not a linear continuum between 1 and 3. Like, now there are lots of clinicians who will take criteria A and B that you get in the DSM, and they will give you ASD1 in one category and ASD2 in another, or vice versa, or ASD2 in one category and ASD3 in the other. So criteria A is persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts, and criteria B is restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. These are the 2 categories. A lot of clinicians are now splitting it up and giving you 1 and 2 in these different categories. Not all clinicians do that, but some of them do. And so I will have people who will say, I'm like ASD2 category A, ASD1 category B, or vice versa. Because this is like, it's not a linear spectrum, it's a multivariable, multi-axis spectrum. And so how do you split some of these cases? Like, you can't is the answer. Like, at some point you are going to have to make an arbitrary criteria and draw an arbitrary line to differentiate between 1, 2, and 3, which is what we do now. But because ASD is all one big giant category, you don't have to worry about edge case sorting. You don't have to worry about, well, is he a 2 or is he a 3? Like, is he a high 3, low 2? That for if you merge the diagnosis together, you don't actually have to deal with that. And like we talk about ASD 1, 2, and 3, these are not diagnostic splits, they're just descriptions of supports. So ASD, and that's why that language exists, to just say, okay, these people need more help, not these people are more autistic or a different type of autistic. And that whole situation is to avoid edge case sorting and the very real complications that come with that, because edge case sorting has very real effects that can ruin your life if it's done poorly. If a clinician,
Especially with ASD2 people, because ASD2 is something which I don't have a ton of direct experience with, but I've had sort of 2 cases of, of people I've become acquaintances with ASD2, and I understand how this is something that is actually I would say, as you said, like a not very often referenced population, but one with very specific needs.
yeah, and so like if you get a 2 when you should have got a 3, if these were different types of autism instead of just different support needs, this can be devastating, right? And if you were to get a high functioning autism when you should have just got a autism in the old category, this has effects, and these things all have effects. So if having the one broad category makes it so maneuvering in this space, you have way more leeway and way more ability, and the clinicians can sort of deal with things on a case by case basis and sort of roll with the tide. Transitions between categories also happen. This is very important to note. People with ASD2 will show improvements over time. People with ASD3, some of them will show improvements over time. And, you could go from ASD3 to ASD2. I know of a few cases of that. You could also go from ASD2 to ASD3 or ASD1 to ASD2. If you're sort of in these areas, and so having just one diagnosis allows, because like in it, the differentiation between 1, 2, and 3 is just about support needs. It doesn't really matter if you go from high to low. That doesn't like change any of the scientific diagnostic properties. It just means, oh, you now have higher support needs than you used to, or whatever. And so, yeah, merging the diagnosis basically solves edge case sorting because you no longer have to deal with that. Another really big one that was pushed pretty explicitly, and this is the one that gets a little harder to defend, is increasing access to supports across the spectrum. Again, when I was diagnosed when I was 16, there was nothing for me. That's why we didn't get it on paper. It's like, there's literally no point. By the way, you're technically disabled. Hope this works out for you. Welcome to the deep end. Have fun not drowning. I'm really lucky in that I didn't really need supports, but I know hundreds of autistic people, probably thousands, who did not get the support that they actually needed. And because of that, they're underemployed, they're undereducated, they struggled with education. Maybe they managed to get their PhD in some cases. And people go, wow, you got your PhD. That's great. And it's like, that's not so great actually, because this person is now a burnt out mess and can't do anything and now lives with their parents and works a menial labor job doing landscaping. And they're probably going to do that for the rest of their life. Yeah, they have a PhD in economics. That's great for them. But, they are now, because they didn't get supports during that entire process, they developed a lot of really severe issues, or severe untreated OCD that sort of spiraled out. Like, a lot of us are really in the trenches. I got lucky. I got really lucky by having the family that I did and the supports from my family. Both of my parents are on the autism spectrum. They didn't know they were on the autism spectrum. but they were both on the autism spectrum and all both ASD1. And because they both were, they were able to help me in ways that most people's families were not able to help them.
I want to just shout out to my own parents here because I am sober. I've been so sober for 3.5 years now. And when I got fired from my job due to my alcoholism a few years ago and realized I was really going to have to get sober and call my parents up for, financial support and help. They didn't blame me, but they were very helpful and have been extremely helpful to me in times when, I've underemployment and things like that. So I just want to say that like I'm very grateful to my parents. So this is supposed to thank you to them, and also recognition that like socioeconomic status can really be protective. And this is obviously something that like support needs for someone who like I'm constantly aware of how lucky I am and how my life would be so, so, so different if I didn't have this, this gift I've been given, and it's something that I think about quite a lot.
Yeah, and like I think that's just really important to emphasize that a lot of people aren't as lucky as you and I were, and didn't get the same supports from their families because their families just weren't able to provide it, and are now paying for that very dearly. And basically, I the joke I tell is if you had Asperger's or PDD-NOS or high functioning autism, it was basically like, good luck, buddy. Hope you don't die. And a lot of us just did. Like a lot of us straight up died. I have the suicide notes to prove it. A story that I have told a few times is when I was looking for a research assistant to help me sort through all the data that I had collected in 2020 during the pandemic. I reached out to a bunch of grad schools and was like, hey, do you have someone who can help me with this? And they asked me for a criteria list of people or of qualities that I would need in the person. And I put in there, you have to be really comfortable reading through suicide notes and like death notices, and a lot of like you have to be, you will be exposed to a lot of extremely depressing things. I mean, my background was like counter ISIS, counter trafficking. I'm fine with it. I mean, or I don't know. It still weighs on me, like honestly. Like I don't think you can't not take away a part of the mental toll from just witnessing this type of thing happening to people like you over and over and over without it somewhat affecting you. But like, you have to ask people, how comfortable are you reading suicide notes? And they go, what the hell? And you're like, yeah, we're dealing with ASD1. You're going to see lots of this stuff. Like this is, people ask me what it's like to survey these populations, and it's like, it is darkness and sadness. That is like, you really want to know what it's actually like under the hood. It is sadness, it is tears, and it is misery. And a lot of those tears and misery are because we're not supported, because we don't have supports. And the move from Asperger's or PDD-NOS to autism means you move up in a category of severity, right? Because you go from being in this thing that no one really cares about and no one gives support to being in this thing that includes people who need basically 24/7 life care. And so when you move to those categories, all of a sudden a whole bunch of resources open up for you and open up for you to get access to. And this probably saved lives. I don't know how many, I can't prove it saved anyone's life. My intuition is that it probably did, because people were able to get better access to resources now because of that diagnostic shift. But also, just being able to get your insurance company to cover therapy sessions when before they weren't, right? Like before you had Asperger's, good luck getting your insurance to cover it. But now you have autism. Oh, your insurance might actually cover an autism specific therapist. And so like increasing, like merging the diagnosis merges you with people who have a much more severe form of autism. But because you are now merged in that group, you have access to the same resources those people do. Now, this comes into the question of resource competition in zero sum games, which we will get into a bit later. But You read the position papers, they talk about this. They talk about this. They might not explicitly say this, but this is under the hood. I remember a lot of the conversations going on at the time. I remember talking to a few members of ASAN, some pretty prominent ones, who were like, think of the resources that we will finally have access to. Like when they go to autism funding, it might be for people like us, finally. And I remember thinking, thank God, right? Because you're drowning in the deep end and someone throws a life raft, are you really going to be like, well, what about the other people drowning? You're going to be like, no, grab the life raft and get on that boat. You're about to die. And then the final point was expanding and loosening the diagnostic criteria needs to be done to account for marginalization. So, this is something I talk about a lot on this podcast, but under old definitions of autism, we didn't really think girls got it, right? We did think girls got it, but we thought they got it a lot less. We weren't accounting for how autism shows up in girls. We weren't accounting for a lot of these different things. And so a lot of girls did not get the diagnosis they needed and then joined an eating disorder anorexia inspiration Tumblr blog. I
Yeah,
wish
I
that
would
was a
say
joke.
no, that is extremely true. I think that it presents differently in women. It was not recognized. This is quite a bad thing. Also, in addition to eating disorders, there are also many different mental health conditions that co-occur with autism. I would say in general that if you are autistic, general treatment will not work. Actually, our treatment should be very elite and different. I'm joking, but but it is true that standard therapeutic treatment methods are may actually be counterproductive in some cases and things. So having having that autism, a common one to be eating disorders and ARFID, where you would have someone with ARFID saying I need help, I have this eating disorder, and then someone say okay, but you have to talk about how you really want to be a ballerina and that's why you got skinny, and then the person with ARFID's okay, I'll say that because I just need the therapy.
Yeah.
And so there's ARFID is now recognized, and that's pretty good, but there is and obviously that was very much a caricature, but I do think there is some truth to that caricature. I think
That's pretty close to the accurate. I
yeah.
wouldn't say that's
So
much of a caricature if it is. Um,
yeah. So I think that I think that that the expanding kind of just realizing, okay, this isn't just something that you know somebody with a male child who had an obsession with Thomas the Tank Engine as a kid now has an extensive train collection, and expanding that beyond that is correct, especially when it comes to, as I see your next point in the slide here, when it comes to race, particularly in the United States. There have been concerns with certain racial populations in the United States, especially when it comes to police brutality and or unfortunate cases of police shootings and things like that when it comes to minority groups and people of color with autism. And these are all things which are are really serious and need to be considered.
yeah, and just general underfunding for marginalized communities and all sorts of problems like that means that if you expand and loosen the criteria for autism, you are more likely to be able to account for cultural differences that lead to different forms of social expression. You are more likely to be able to. One thing that comes up a lot when I interview Asian Americans or Asian Canadians is that a lot of their parents were like, no, this kid doesn't have autism. They're just Asian. This is just how we are, right? This is, yeah, they're obsessed with math and strictly studying. That's a good quality. You should do that. Who cares if they're introverted and quiet and whatever? And a lot of Asian people were not diagnosed because of cultural stereotypes about Asians and things like that. And then a lot of Black people were not diagnosed because they would see characteristics in Black people that were culturally different from white people. And because the way that autism was benchmarked was on white people, it's going to include, and if the majority of people coming through your clinic are white people, your perception of what autism is probably going to be more centered around what white guys look like rather than a black girl. Especially in the US with its long history of medical racism, in Canada with indigenous populations like First Nations people, it's brutal, right? Have I have yet to meet, I've met several First Nations autistics. I have yet to meet one who was diagnosed as a child. I'm sure they're out there. I have not met one yet. By expanding these criteria and creating like a sort of default open scenario instead of a default closed, and loosening the requirements and loosening gatekeeping around who gets to be autistic and who doesn't get to be autistic based on certain criterias, means that people will fall through the cracks less. And the whole idea was that a permissive system for autism is better than a restrictive one. A system that sort of, the idea is like, look, okay, we know we're going to get false positives and we know we're going to get false negatives. So we know that we are going to just, with every single condition, you will diagnose someone who doesn't have it as having it. You will also not diagnose people who have it as not having it. Do you want to err on the side of false positives or false negatives? And which is more important to correct for? And the sort of merge the diagnosis and expand the criteria crowd was like, obviously the false negatives are the ones, like the ones who don't get diagnosed are the ones that need to be diagnosed, and it's more important. It is way worse if you have a false negative than if you have a false positive. If you have a false positive, the guy's going to be a little confused, right? That's about as bad as it gets, right? You get told you're autistic and you're not autistic. You go, I don't really relate to these people that much. You get told you're
Yeah, you
not
you
autistic
you might
and
go to
you
a
are
conference and be
autistic.
like, these people are strange.
Yes, exactly. Like you show up to your rationalist conference and your EA conference expecting to find your people, and you don't, and you go, what the hell? Yeah, but the sort of worst case scenario in the case of someone being diagnosed if they're not is it's a little weird and awkward for him. Whereas, as we've talked about throughout this podcast, many more problems if you don't get diagnosed and need to. And so the argument is, look, this is a serious problem that seriously needs to be addressed. Let's err on the side of false negatives and let's care more about that. So, like, to sort of sum up all their arguments, because we've been talking about this for a while, ASAN saw real issues within the current system. Asperger's, PDD, NOS, and high functioning autism were basically all the same thing. There were a lot of people on the Asperger side of the spectrum who were being systematically failed by virtually every institution that existed. There were thousands of people who were slipping through the cracks, who would be diagnosed under DSM 5, who weren't being diagnosed under DSM 4. ASAN thought the best solution was to open up diagnostic criteria, remove semantic categories, take down barriers, remove gatekeeping, and really, there was just a really big push to de-emphasize the pathologization of treatment and emphasize social solutions and understanding not autism not as something that needs to be cured, but as something that needs to be supported. And their plan worked. We are 15 years we're 12 years post split. I think if you look at the goals that they have and what happened, it worked. They did what they wanted to do. They achieved the goals that they set out to achieve. The diagnostic criteria was loosened and expanded, and autism diagnosis exploded in DSM 5. Look at the rates, they skyrocket with DSM 5. This is a good thing. This does not mean more people are getting autism. This means more people who are autistic who didn't realize it are realizing this very crucial thing about them that has life-saving potential. And I mean that in a very literal way. I'm not being hyperbolic here. Autism has skyrocketed, and that's a good thing. Awareness has sort of gone crazy to the point where it's now like memeified, where everyone knows what autism is. Where, like, when I got diagnosed with Asperger's, I would say I have Asperger's, and people would be like, "You have Asperger's?" It was like, "Oh God, please no." But like right now, if it, like everyone jokes about being autistic. I mean, it's a constant issue in my research where people call themselves autistic. I'm like, "Oh, are you really autistic?" They're like, "Nah, it's just a meme." Diagnosis in marginalized groups has skyrocketed. A huge amount of the uptick in diagnosis were women getting diagnosed with autism. And many people who previously needed help were able to get help. A lot of the category confusion that came about was no longer a problem because now the only categories are your support needs, not your like type of autism. And so if you need support needs, you just get more support or you get bumped up a category, and no one wonders like, did you meet all the criteria for 2 or 3 or whatever. And this is your sort of George Bush on the aircraft carrier mission accomplished moment, right? Where ASAN is like total victory, we have achieved everything. But also like George Bush on the aircraft carrier when he flew that total mission accomplished banner. Um, the story doesn't end here. I wish we could end here. And I wish we could say, look, and this is why the diagnostic criteria was expanded, and everything has gone perfectly since then. But this is not where the podcast ends. I've sort of been obfuscating things here. There were a lot of people already on the autism side of things before DSM 5. Pre DSM 5, basically the only way that you would get a diagnosis if something was very noticeably different about you. So, like, I will say, like, I have said I've noticed many differences between late and early diagnosed people. One thing that I've noticed about early diagnosed people who are like diagnosed in the 2000s is they tend to be a lot more weird. Just like they are much more noticeably autistic than their non-autistic counterparts of the same age. You pretty much only got diagnosed if you were very dysfunctional or very weird. Underdiagnosis wasn't quite a problem for people with ASD3. No one was sort of sitting around being like, gee, I wonder if this guy's got a cognitive development disorder. Like ASD2 and ASD3 were not falling through the cracks. They were not slipping through the cracks. They are very noticeably and distinctly different.
I want to, this is, I understand this is like a pejorative term and I'm not I'm mentioning it. I'm not using it. I want to, the use mention distinction here. There is when I was homeschooled, but my first year of high school, I did some months at doing exchange with a family, and I was attending a convent school in Spain in this town. And in the town, there was a young man who had very clearly ASD2, and he was so unlike someone with profound autism like my brother, who really could not be outside without like out like like really in public without someone, and also would get very scared if there were tons of people around without a familiar face. This man was able to like walk around town, etc., but he clearly was not, and he attended school and graduated, but he was not able to have a job. I assumed he was not able to have a job. And so he would walk around all day while his parents worked around the town. And obviously, given his disorder and issue, I worried about him because, like, sometimes I'd walk home from school and he'd talk to me on his walk on the walk when I was walking home from school, and he was a very sweet man. I worried about him, because clearly, like, I hope he's doing well. I haven't heard from him in 10 years or anything, but I hope he's doing well because he's obviously very vulnerable. But this is someone who would have probably been referred to in prior times as the village idiot, and and that is in a crueler age. That's probably an epithet that would have been applied to someone like my brother as well. And so I think with ASD1, maybe maybe we would have been like the eccentric person, but we wouldn't have been, you know, um, treated like that, or so identifiably recognized in this way.
Yeah. So this is all to say there were people who weren't missed, and those people were affected by the diagnostic changes as well. We've talked about this before in previous episodes. I did one with Freddie DeBoer. I did one with Amy Letts. If I remember, I'll put those in the show comments or in the show notes. If I forget to do that, then I will, you could just search through my podcast, Freddie DeBoer, Amy Letts. You can find those episodes. Basically, anyone who wasn't on our side of the spectrum sort of got left behind, unfortunately. The neurodiversity bus started to leave the station, and we sort of, as the neurodiversity bus started leaving the station, you look back and you go, oops, might have forgot some people on this ride. There were a lot of serious consequences. ASD1 basically took over as the face of autism. So autism used, like, if you said autism in the 2000s, no one thought about people like me. No one thought about people like you, right? They thought about people like your brother. And when we said we need to do something about autism, it was always we need to help people like your brother. That is no longer the case. Just flatly, that is not how autism is spoken about these days. It is just, I don't know what else to say. We have taken over as the representatives. This is for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is, quite frankly, I think ableism. People with ASD1 are just way more palatable to the average person, right? When you say autism and you have a person who can be articulate and profound and say many meaningful and interesting things and give you challenging things to think about, you are far more likely to remember, oh, yes, autism, that guy, than you are a person who has profound intellectual disabilities.
It's sort of, I would say, even kind of before this, the way that, like, you know, my before this kind of happened, it would be like, oh, Rain Man. I would be that. Meanwhile, my parents were like, no, actually, like he's not a savant. That's not all. Not like some profoundly autistic people are savants. Not all of them are, though. My brother is not. I think that. Um, but also, I will say that, like, the media depiction went from Rain Man to Sherlock, and this left a lot of profoundly autistic people behind.
Yeah. Basically, the narrative shifted from them to us. And so the priorities get shifted from them to us. The framing of things got shifted from them to us. And like I sort of jokingly refer to this as the autism wars because these wars were raging, right? In when I got diagnosed with autism, I got on the autism forum and it was like, these autism parents are the worst. We need to destroy them, type of thing. And I always thought that was a little bit weird, not gonna lie. Like I never quite got it. I'm like, why are we mad at them? A lot of it was because I think I just had great parents. And so I was like, I don't know. My non-autistic parents are pretty understand. They were definitely autistic, but at the time I was like, my non-autistic parents are fine. Uh, you know, and basically, when autism shifts from one population to the other, the population it shifts to gets privileged over them. It's also just it's it's harder to deal with ASD3, right? Like the logistical issues around ASD3 and ASD2 are far more significant than the ones around ASD1. Just think about anything you want to do with an autistic person. It is way easier to do it with a person who has ASD1. And so, you know, one thing Freddie DeBoer points out is like, there they not only are people speaking over them, many of them literally cannot speak, right? Like many of them cannot advocate for themselves. So you say nothing about us without us. Who is us that is, the about us without us? Without who? The people who can articulate themselves, the people who have well-paying engineering jobs at Google, like those people. And it got so bad.
I mean, in some ways, I feel like I have to, like, in doing this, one of the reasons why I really wanted to come on this podcast, aside from, having so much fun last time, John, was just like, thinking about my brother. And I've had I will cop to doing the extremely unproductive thing of getting into tedious arguments with people online, probably other ASD1 people who have, accused me of being ableist towards my brother for simply acknowledging the fact that his needs and, acknowledging the fact that autism is in fact, a disorder that can cause severe harm to people. And so in some ways, like, my brother can't advocate for himself, but I do think it's really important to maybe try to, in some ways, like, advocate for him.
Yeah, and a lot of the idea of self-advocacy is that we can advocate for ourselves. This is a framing that you get from the civil rights movement, where it's like gay people can advocate for themselves, and they can. In the civil rights movement, black people saying, we want to be part of the conversation. And it's like, this is awesome. Yes, you absolutely should. The women's rights movement, we want an equal part. Autism just literally is not that. And it isn't an analogous situation. And a lot of autistic people think it is. Or they think that by advocating for
I
autistic
mean, my
people,
brother doesn't
they're
even know that
advocating
he
for
has
everyone.
autism. Like my
Yeah,
brother doesn't know what autism is because he doesn't have the cognitive capability to understand that he's disabled.
yeah. And like I said, you have people who do not know they're in a city. How are they supposed to advocate for themselves if they don't understand like basic social civic concepts like cities?
Or jobs. There's a story that my family tells because I mean my brother he tends to speak he verbalizes a lot with either stimming from like movies or songs or poetry which he's picked up, but when he's making a novel sentence that's very rare, and so we tend to remember it. I remember one time he was 8 years old and he liked to like balance on things, so we put him in gymnastics class, and the kids were talking about, and so this was, gosh, probably like close to 20 years ago now, but the kids were talking about what their parents did and what their parents did for jobs. And my brother would normally like never say anything, but one time he piped up. This time he piped up and he said, "My dad takes out the garbage." My father is not a garbage man. Just simply that, like, that is a task that my brother had seen my dad do, and was just in his brain was like, "That's my dad's job."
Yeah. And like I told this story on a different pod or in a different episode where I was talking to a person with profound autism who was able to speak, who was able to say some things, and he thought Jesus literally lived in the church. Like like Barney lives in the TV, Jesus lives in the church. And you know, perhaps he is getting at some profound theological truths there, like Jesus is literally in the Eucharist in the church, perhaps. But like what is actually going on there is he thinks that Jesus has a home and that home is inside that building because that's what he's been told. And so like that person cannot seriously advocate for policy and cannot seriously advocate for how he thinks tax dollars should be allocated to better help him or what research priorities he wants. You just can't do that.
I'm just trying to think of explaining the idea of government or taxes or even like what a country is to my brother. None of these are concepts my brother understands. He does understand planes and travel, and so he, like, in terms of like going to different places, but countries, these kind of fictional concepts, shared concepts, are just, I think, totally lost to him.
Yeah, and so if you don't have any of that shared conceptuality, how are you going to advocate for yourself? And so people ask me all the time for concrete examples, and so I thought we'd give a few. So one of them that gets cited a lot that is a sort of concrete example of a phenomena that happens all the time is there was famously a panel, a Harvard research panel about profound autism, and they were talking about cures and treatment for autism. This panel was attacked by ASAN members at Harvard. It was shut down, and it was prevented. And there was language around harm and genocide and how they're literally genociding us. I saw the comments. I was there. Like there were many autistic people who were like, they are literally trying to do the T4 program on us at Harvard by talking about autism cures at this panel. Thank God we shut it down. This is what social justice looks like. The researchers were attacked, they were forced to apologize for their harmful language, and their harmful language was not harmful. They were talking about treatments and interventions for people with profound autism to make their lives better.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know how shutting down something that'll help someone who is living with such profound autism that, like, this is very common. They're unable to like use the toilet by themselves and all that intervention, which is like help like is required. Imagine telling, being a Harvard student and telling that person's caregiver with a straight face that no, 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 trying to help your kid who has this issue is, I don't know. I think we got to bring back shame, man.
Literally. Yeah. Like
Like, how earlier we were like, oh, people should be proud of their autism as like
yeah.
hope. Okay, maybe not for these people.
Yeah, you guys don't get it. Yeah, there is a part of me that like sincerely believes that, where it's like, how do you not see what is so obvious here? And this is not isolated to them. So I have many friends who I have made over the years who work in autism research. Many of them work on research for people with profound autism, and they have nothing but seething hatred and contempt for the neurodiversity movement. Many of them themselves are autistic. Many of themselves have ASD1, and they got into autism research because they were interested in autism. And the amount of garbage that they have to deal with, right? Like they're faced with paper retractions because they used terms like challenge or something like that, or saying like severe autism or like self-injury, and using terms like that. And because ASAN has put how you're supposed to talk about autism and like push these on journals to be like, here's how you talk about autism, and so if you don't talk about it this way, you're doing an ableism, and how like restrictive that gets to them and how frustrated that makes them, there are many cases.
So profoundly autistic people, because they also don't they have difficulties with like emotional expression and communicating, as well, I guess like all autistic people do, but it's very pronounced, can engage in violence and also like self-harm. And usually when they are experiencing extreme distress, we're very lucky this is not something that my brother has done, but it's something that's very, very, in that way, he's a bit of an outlier, I'm afraid to say. I mean, it's good for us, but for a group, it's very sad that this happens. I've seen like, I've read a lot about this. The fact that my brother is not prone to this is something which I literally have like, as a family, like we've thanked God for. This is something which is not, I'm not like condemning people whose family members with pronounced autism have this. This is just luck in a lot of ways. And I think that like, I just want to say that like, and I think also the influence my parents too. I will say that's probably an issue, like an influence as well. Like there have probably been a few good things that they've done, but generally, like there is no way of describing these. This is just sad. It's just really sad, and you can't like to insist on sugarcoating this phenomenon. And when you're trying to like help people who are dealing with these very sad situation, is it's just very detrimental to like a very vulnerable population who is actually in desperate need of help.
Yep. And like the attacks get vitriolic and personal, and I've had friends who they didn't get fired because they have sane people working in their lab who were able to shut them down, but they have people like saying emailing their supervisors being like, you need to be fired for what you said about autism, because they'll say like, profound autism comes with extreme challenges, and we look forward to a future in which they don't, or in which we can eliminate these challenges. It's like pretty normal statement when you're talking about self-injurious behavior. Like I do look forward to a future, if it is possible, where people with profound autism do not slam their head into a wall. That
Yeah.
I look forward to that future, and I think we should treat that. And I've had friends who have gotten emails to their offices being like, you should fire this friend because of what he said. And what he said was a benign statement like that. Any talk of cures, any talk of treatment, autism doesn't need to be treated. It's fine the way it is. You just need to be more socially supportive. The problem with autism is not autism, it's the lack of support. I wish that was true. That's not even true for ASD1, right? And that's not
No,
even talk. This is not even
that's not true
considering
for
ASD3.
ASD1. It's, the idea that, like, I don't know, it's such a bizarre idea. I mean, I do think
Like,
this. I
it's
do
true
think
to
that,
some
like,
extent, right? Like
yeah. I
there
mean,
is
okay,
truth to it, but
sure. I will. Okay,
it's not the full
here's an
truth.
example. Okay, here's an example of my brother. This is a bit of a funny story. So when my parents are very devout Catholics, I'm Catholic myself, Christian. When I was 5 or 6 years old. My brother was newly diagnosed. We went on, as if your people are familiar with Lourdes. Lourdes is a place where Catholics, not all Catholics, but it's not a dogma of the Catholic Church, but some Catholics believe that Mary appeared to a saint named Bernadette there in the 19th century. And there have been cases of people, if you believe in cures there and miracles happening at Lourdes. So we took a trip to Lourdes because, we were going to pray for Joseph. And so I have been to Lourdes. And also on this trip, we were stopping by Rome, and we were in the Vatican in St. Peter's. And my brother had just discovered that St. Peter's and these old churches have a great echo. And so he would just scream because he loved to hear the echo. And it was pretty clear, though, that, like, he wasn't just like a naughty child, that it was pretty clear that, like, he was disabled. But this woman, there was another pilgrim, I guess, there, my mother is Venezuelan, by the way, who, this is important to the story, and this woman, I guess, was Spanish. You could kind of tell from her accent, and she looked very disdainfully over to my mother, and she said, "These Mexicans don't know how to raise their children." And two things that will get my Venezuelan mother very annoyed is insulting her parenting, but particularly her disabled child, and also calling her a Mexican, which led to her ragingly going over to this woman and getting in her face and being like, "He's disabled, you idiot. He's a child of God. What are you doing?" And then a sort of a screaming match ensued. It got so bad, this poor Swiss guard had to come over. He's like in the Michelangelo outfit and like carrying a halberd, and he's just like, ladies, this is the house of God." Anyway.
Yeah.
So in terms of social acceptance for ASD3.
Yes. Not where it should be. But yeah, the whole idea that like the only issue is a lack of social support is, I just don't think bears out in the evidence. But also, like, research and framing is skewed so heavily to ASD1. So we talked about issues with like research getting shut down, but there's another aspect of research wherein an example of a paper that I've talked about on this podcast, it suggested that actually this new study shows autistic people don't actually struggle to communicate. Cool. That would be a cool finding if it were true. If you meet literally any autistic person, you're going to know it's not true. But the literal words in the paper were autistic people do not struggle to communicate. It's just a different style of communication. You would never say that if you had a person with ASD3 in mind, right? Like you would sound like an insane person. The only group of autistic people who that could possibly be pertaining to are people with ASD1. Just across the board. And in a peer-reviewed paper that got a lot of press, it literally said autistic people do not struggle to communicate. And so you have a situation in which it's like, okay, this is not a lack of nuance. Like, you did not say ASD1. This is just like a straight up erasure of
Yeah,
part of the spectrum.
that's
Like, there's
just.
literally no other way to describe it other than complete erasure.
Have they met ASD3 people? Like, I'm so confused by this.
So I sent them an email to clarify. I'm like, what do you mean by this? And they did not respond. And it was like, hey, this is kind of weird that you said this. Do you not know that this is not an accurate statement? Could you perhaps clarify autism one or ASD one?
Okay, you have mentioned this is not, this is a completely coming up with, kind of like on the fly here. So, if anyone, I hope no one takes offense, and if anyone, like, this is very much like random something which is not supported that you would hear in a podcast, which is unlike John's, which is very well researched. So, take this like, okay, you're saying that like a lot of people who research autism have autism, ASD1 probably. Black
Yes.
and white thinking is a thing,
Yes.
and also struggles to communicate. This person did
Yeah.
not respond to your email saying this person has autism.
Oh, no,
But
no, these are autistic researchers.
okay, so okay, all right, then I guess I'm right.
Yeah.
In
And
terms of like
and
black and white thinking, struggling to like struggling to not communicating ideas in a very helpful
yes.
way, which like I don't know. Do you see what are you picking up what I'm throwing
Yes.
down here?
And not being particularly nuanced in your approach to these issues, and having a sort of one size fits all solution and a dogmatic insistence on your own correctness and all these things. Turns out when you get autistic people to advocate for themselves, they recapitulate the issues internal to autism in their advocacy. Who would have known? But yeah,
Yeah.
so these are just some examples, but like, this happens all the time, where basically you look at the amount of research that's focused on people with ASD1 and ASD3, it's wildly disproportionate ASD1. Like, there were meta-analyses done of profound autism versus non-profound autism done in the last several years. Disproportionately ASD1, disproportionately low support needs, because, like, I'll be honest, as an autism researcher, it's just way easier. Like, I talk to my friends who do ASD3 research. It's so hard for them. Like, they can't put out a survey. Like, I could put out surveys. They cannot do a survey. If they want to get a survey answer, they need to like coordinate with parents. They need to coordinate care. They need to have sensory rooms that they can put these people in. A lot of these people don't want to cooperate with researchers, because why would you,
Basically,
right?
so an example of this, just in terms of care, like my brother, like he's an adult now, right? So my parents were like, well, he shouldn't go to the pediatrician anymore. He's like literally an adult man. So they took him to like a regular like physician, and the physicians told them, frankly, like it's pediatrics who are really well versed in knowing how to treat patients and like diagnose patients who like aren't able to like really advocate for themselves or like discuss their own symptoms. So my brother, when he goes to the doctor, he goes to a pediatrician for his like primary care provider. Obviously not when if he needs like something a specialty, but his primary care provider is a pediatrician, because like that is the kind of doctor that is trained to like most GPs like don't have the kind of training to deal with a profoundly autistic person. So like I can imagine like, and that's just so I can imagine like imagine that in a research setting. Like of course there are greater complications.
Yeah. And so you just don't do it as much, because why would you? So let's say your university gets $500 billion to study, or not 500 million. I'll give a lower number. Let's say your university gets $5 million to research autism. Just the autism research bucket. Let's assume this exists. They throw 5 million in the autism research bucket. How many papers do you think you will be able to stretch out of $5 million if you study profound autism? How many do you think you'll be able to stretch out if you study ASD1? The answer is you will probably get 10 to 1, right? You will be able to crank out 10 studies on people without profound autism for everyone, just because of resource costs and just because of resource constraints and because of publishing schedules. You can rush people with ASD1. You can be like, look, I get that you don't want to talk to me right now, but we only have a week to do this, so like time's ticking. Let's hurry up with this. You can't do that with someone who has profound autism. Like you are there on their terms. And if they don't want to be there,
Yeah.
they're going to let you know. And like this is perhaps a funny story, but like I was interviewing someone who had ASD2, and then sort of halfway through he looks at his dad and he's like, I don't like this guy. I don't want to talk to him anymore. It's like, fair enough, dude. Like you don't have to like me. um, like as a researcher, what are you supposed to do when the guy's like, I don't like you, I'm not doing anything anymore? Nothing. You are doing nothing. That's what you're doing, and your paper gets delayed. And so if you are trying to get out papers, and if you are trying to get your career advanced and get a tenure track and fight for those two positions left in the world,
Yeah.
there is one place that you will want to go. And this is not people being evil. This is inertia, right? This is just institutional inertia. Path of least resistance is ASD1, and so everything sort of defaults to there. Another sort of really, I find this an absurd example, facilitated communication. We need to talk about this. So facilitated communication,
Yeah,
for
we
those who don't
do. We
know,
really do.
is is the it is a
You
method,
should
a
explain
proposed method.
because I
Yeah.
will get very angry when
Okay.
explaining this and
Yeah.
probably use a lot of blue language. So please go
Yes.
ahead.
um, yeah. So facilitated communication is a proposed method of communication where you have a facilitator who helps guide a disabled person to be able to spell things out or to communicate. It's often called spelling to communicate. It is the assumption that the only thing wrong with a person is their motor functions. And if you could simply just assist their motor functions, they will be able to communicate. This does work for people with motor function disabilities. So, with people who have cerebral palsy, this does actually work for some of them. And many of them, through facilitated communication, will develop the muscles that they need in order to properly spell things out.
To be clear, this is
Yeah.
not something in which there is a separate person helping them. It is they are doing this themselves. There is no communicator. They are themselves a communicator once they've developed that strength.
Yeah. So in the initial stages, though, there is another person assisting them, right? It's sort of like a physiotherapy where
Yeah,
your muscles
sure.
are so atrophied that you need help, and so you have someone in that middle ground. But then they strengthen enough, and they get to a point where they can either do it completely unassisted or with mechanical assists or something like that. But they are independently leading the communication themselves. The idea is that you have this intact mind in your body and you are reaching out to spell things and able to communicate in alternative ways. There are also things like AAC devices that profoundly autistic people can use, which are symbols and shapes and things that you press to on an iPad or a keyboard that point to things. That is not facilitated communication. That is a completely different thing. All of this is to say, facilitated communication is often used for profoundly autistic people in very bad ways, where the person themselves is not actually doing anything. The facilitator is the one spelling things out. And they have been able to prove this. And they prove this by showing the facilitator one picture and showing the disabled person a different picture and seeing which one the disabled person spells. And in many of the cases, they will spell out the things that the facilitator has seen and not the things that the disabled person has seen.
This is the message passing test. Facilitated communication, spelling to communicate. It's also referred to as, RPM, fails the message passing test. It has been thoroughly discredited. It's been debunked by countless studies, disavowed by every relevant medical association. This is something, these associations, they also discourage the use of like other therapies. I do want to say that like there are also, because facilitated communication has been so debunked and it's been so widely debunked, there are like different like people are trying to sell this, but under like different code names. If you don't mind, I have like a list of tells. So this is of like red flags. So these centers tend to explicitly endorse the only motor difficulties model of autism on their websites. You know, the idea that autistic people have intact minds and that autism is something akin to a bad stutter, which of course completely contradicts the scientific consensus that severe autism, you know, affects the autistic genes affect parts of the brain and body and also cause severe, it can not always, but usually go along with severe cognitive impairments. If a center's research section does not mention the message passing test, if they say that autistic people have difficulty doing this with their parents and you need to hire a certain coach or to do this with, is also a huge red flag. If they admit to supporting FC or RPM or spelling to communicate S2C, these are things which are also bad. In the United States, if they're not affiliated with the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the ASHA, because the ASHA maintains the substantial and serious risks of FC outweigh any anecdotal reports of its benefit. It's a very harmful practice. I think it's a form of fraud and cranks, and there are people who have been deluded into thinking that they are doing good things. I will say the problem with these practitioners is that, you know, they frequently flout professional guidelines, support disproven method, and fail to offer any concrete evidence of their claims. At best, they have very poor judgment. At worst, they are running a scam. Neither groups of these people should be anywhere near very vulnerable people like my brother, much less trying to communicate on their behalf. This is just, sorry for going on this rant. It's
No,
something which I
no,
find.
you are completely correct. However, a lot of autism self-advocacy groups will use the testimonies of people who advocate for themselves using facilitated communication, and they will use it as legitimate. So they will say, look, it's not just us who support neurodiversity. Look at these well-articulated essays by these people with ASD 3 and 2 who were able to use facilitated communication to express their needs and express their feelings and express their wants. This would not be said in any other group, right? This is only because people with ASD1 are hearing what they want to hear and saying, look, see, these other people agree with us.
I mean, I don't know. The New York Times, I read this, I did not verify this myself, but I do trust Freddie Boer, and he recently published in his blog a bit about how the New York Times published a letter, which was written in letters to the editor section from the public, which was purported to be written by an autistic man through facilitated communication. I will also say I have come across a document which is called, one second. Oh, yes, Disability, Sexuality, and Intimacy, which is the idea that a few practitioners believe that in facilitating romantic relationships between or with nonverbal people, there is a bit in the document where they say they hope family members will be non-judgmental if the nonverbal people wish to enter the sexual arena, which is such a gross thing in terms of, this would be the abuse of a severely disabled person. I cannot believe the writers of this document signed their names to it.
Yeah. And so there's a very high profile case of sexual abuse through facilitated communication. If you are interested in watching it, it's on Netflix. It's called Tell Them You Love Me.
My name, no. Tell them you love me. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's called Tell Them You Love Me. Have you
Yeah.
seen it?
I have not, but I've seen parts of it,
Don't
and
watch
I'm
it.
familiar
Don't
with it.
watch it. you will give yourself an aneurysm. Sort of explain just how deep this rot goes. Here is a fun paper that I came across recently from 2021 in the Journal of Disability and Religion from Duke University, a paper called Communication Agency and Self-Relation in ASD in the Letters of Paul. This is a paper published by Duke. Duke is not a backwater diploma mill. This is a serious, legitimate theologian doing serious, legitimate theology in a serious, legitimate paper. And in it, the entire paper is talking about using facilitated communication and the testimonies of people who have communicated through facilitated communication in order to do theology. It is atrocious. Like, I rarely get like deeply angry reading disability studies theology. I often get eye rolly, like, oh, this is kind of stupid. I was angry reading this paper. Like, I had to close it several times, and like I had to put it on an e-reader and put the e-reader down at least 6 times to get through this paper because it made me so upset. It is super pro neurodiversity, super like it is basically the definition of like an ASD1 centric view of autism, but it's literally doing theology by facilitated communication. I cannot express to you how insane this is.
Okay, this is like, okay, so when my brother was small, okay, so like we were a Christian homeschooling family. All the movies we watched as kids were like, okay, so like obviously Prince of Egypt, but like as well as other like and Veggie Tales, but like there were specifically these like I have these like the CCC Catholic movies and these animated movies about different lives of saints. And there was one my brother had a favorite, and his favorite was the one about Saint Francis of Assisi. And there it's the bit in the story where Saint Francis is asking his father for money so that he can build this church. And the line that my brother loved to repeat to himself, but God has spoken to me, Father. And somehow in my brother's brain, he was able to connect like going to church on Sunday with the concept of God and like related this to the religious movie, although he also quoted this line in other contexts as well. But very frequently when we would be at Sunday Mass, my brother would stand up and declaim, "But God has spoken to me, Father." And I feel like with this, I haven't read this paper, so I can't definitively say, and I want to be careful here, but it does sound like, and I have a strong suspicion that what this person is doing would be similar to a person hearing my brother in church and believing that they'd had a vision, that he'd actually had a vision of God.
Yes. Yes. That is it. And it is like this is serious scholarship. This is actually what passes in disability studies theology journals. Why? Because what autism is has so radically shifted from what we used to conceptualize to this new conception where everyone's pretty much ASD1, right? It's just how functional are like everyone has an intact mind. No one has an intellectual disability. Autism is just a difference. It's not a disability. It doesn't need a cure. The only way this type of thing can be published is if these conditions come. Another really big one is the erosion of guardianship rights. And this is one I've talked about with Amy Lutz. You can hear more about that. ASAN on its website has like one of its stated goals is to remove parental guardianship rights from autistic people, like from autistic parents. Like, it is a literal stated goal. I'll pull it up, and this is like always a fun thing to drop on people when I'm talking about them.
I mean, I think with somebody like my brother, it would be very difficult to argue against. And I do understand there can be some concerns as you talked about, like the edge cases. But I do think there is a specific concern of people who are maybe on the lighter side of ASD3 or the heavier side of ASD2, particularly with women with grooming. And that's just, it's very sad. It,
He's actually cut
it's,
both ways. So you do get
I've also seen it
exploitation from
online. I've
parents and
also seen it
caregivers.
online with ASD1 as well, but that's a slightly different conversation because it's not about
Yeah,
the guardianship. But
yeah, but
I can really see it in that case.
so you get cases like that, but you also get cases where people with ASD2 will get groomed online and then meet a person who comes to their house and takes them away, and their parents can't get them back from this person who has taken them away because their parents don't have legal guardianship over their profoundly disabled child. Just to so like yeah, there of course there are abuses within guardianship, but like in most cases guardianship is what needs to happen, and parents are the best guardians. Of course there are abuses within there, but like
No,
there are
of course
abuses
there are,
everywhere.
but no, but the idea of that's what I was trying to get at. Like there are many cases of here's the thing, like there are many cases of people with ASD1 struggling with grooming, but like they're online because like this is particularly common with girls, which is unfortunate, but it's true. It's just not something I myself experienced, but having being an autistic woman and being online, it's something that people talk about. The thing I would say with like, but like I could see it being worse for more vulnerable populations. And again, I'm not giving like carte blanche to anyone to all like guardians. Of course, there are abuses, of course, but like it's just generally like the idea that these people that that these people are these kids like they're not like they're vulnerable people, and the idea that that they cannot they should prevent the people who love them and are trying to care for them the most from protecting them is just it's very strange.
Yeah, and so I just want to read this from the ASAN website so people believe me. Ending guardianship: how the state governments take away our rights to make choices and how we can stop it. Freedom to make choices is a human right. Adults without disability often take the rights to make choices for granted. Adults with disabilities cannot take the right to make choices for granted. This is because we do not always get to make our choices. Sometimes other people take away our right to make those choices. Often, if anyone thinks a person with a disability cannot make good choices, that person with a disability has their right to make choices taken away. This is because of a series of state laws called guardianship laws. Anyone who thinks a person with a disability cannot make good choices can ask a court for guardianship over them. If the court gives that person who asked guardianship over the person with a disability, the person with a disability's right to make choices is taken away. All people, no matter what disability they have or what support needs they have, can make choices. This page will tell you about how guardianship works, guardianship laws, and how you can fight to join the right to make choices. That's their introduction paragraph. You can find their full statement about guardianship.
It's kind of like
Here is
saying,
their
okay,
goal
because we know
statement.
old people get 1 second. It's kind of like saying, okay, we know that there are old people who've been taken advantage of through legal guardianship for like their money. There's like a movie with the actress who played Gone Girl about this. That means that like even somebody with terrible Alzheimer's who sundowns and is walking around in a diaper at night doesn't know they can make those choices. Like, what? Like, like, I don't understand how there can be such a lack of nuance. And of course, I also like, as in a previous podcast, I'm a radical feminist. Of course, I understand that stuff like guardianship can be abused. As a feminist, I'm very concerned about this because up until 5 minutes ago, this was very much the case with women. So like I'm extraordinarily sensitive to the concerns that this is something that can be abused and used, especially against like gender non-conforming people or women. And I'm very aware of that. It's something I'm very sensitive to, and I think that, but there are reasonable grounds here and reasonable cases, and I think it might be hard conversations, but I think like good conversations that like need to be had about this, because the ASAN position is just it's wild.
Here are some bolded statements. All guardianship takes away someone's rights. That's wrong. ASAN wants to end all guardianship. Not not we want to protect people in these edge cases. All. Like this is unambiguous. We want to prevent the parents of people with people with profound autism from being able to make legal choices on their behalf. Again, these are people who don't understand the concept of a city. They can make choices, right? They can make choices about what they want to eat. They can make choices about what they want to wear. They can make choices about the TV shows they want to watch. Great. They should not be making choices about where they live because many of them can't make those choices. many of them fundamentally do not have the ability to do long-term risk analysis, right? It, this is not ableism. This is describing a simple fact. They are not capable of doing that. And no facilitated communication is going to convince me otherwise that they can actually secretly do that, right? This is not how it works.
The two things I would say about to this too as well is like I again if a group were to say we are worried about cases where there is abuse or we want safer guardrails, this is something which would be
Yeah,
completely different and I would have a very different attitude towards this. But
absolutely.
that's not what's but that's
Completely
this is
on
something
board.
which like exactly like I would be very much in favor of that. I would find that a very appealing goal. These goals seem bad. I will also say generally, I think that for people who don't have I think a lot of this stuff is caused by ASD1 people who don't have a lot of familiarity with ASD3. And a lot of people, I think, maybe would benefit from just spending time with people with ASD2 or ADSD3 and understanding what profound autism really looks like. I will say, if one might object, okay, well, then why are the parents of people with profound autism falling for the intact mind stuff or facilitated communication? And I'm just going to say profound autism is very sad. My brother has a pretty good case of profound autism in terms of like he's not violent. He is able to say I love you. In fact, what's one of the sentences that he says the most is he'll say I love you to me and he'll say I love you to my mom and dad. And we're lucky to have that. That's something that like a lot of profoundly autistic kids don't do. Or I say kids, but But my brother will never fall in love. He will never have a friend. He will never have a job. He'll never read. He pretty much hangs out and my dad makes him sandwiches and he watches Pixar movies and does puzzles. And in the summer he goes swimming and sometimes he rides his bike. And that's pretty much his life. I think it would be better if my brother had the opportunity to have a full life. And I don't think I'm being insulting to him by saying that he simply is not. And that's on top of the fact that, like, I will one day, along with my siblings, be the caregiver for my brother. But I'm in the lucky position where socioeconomically, I do not have to stress too much about this. But I understand that I'm in a very lucky position here, and there are many people for whom this is a profound concern. I want to say people for whom parents who are put in this position and they see this, the motivated reasoning to want to believe something like facilitated communication will be very strong. And that is why this happens. So I think it's true that people with ASD1 should familiarize themselves with ASD3 because I think a lot of the times the bad rhetoric is caused by not being familiar. But in terms of the objection, well, so and so with profound autism, their parents think this is great. This is why. It's because they also just like imagine like as a mother, as a father, like wanting to get to know your kid and thinking, oh, this is a way I can finally talk to them. And finally, they'll be able to express their love and affection and they'll be able to understand it when I express it to them. And you can see why this would cause someone a lot of hope. Unfortunately, it is a false promise, as we've discussed.
Yeah, and like I can't fault parents who, go the biomedical route. I know it's quack science. I don't support any of the science. I understand the reasons completely.
What do you mean the
Like
biomedical?
like the alternative science community, like the hyperbaric
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
chambers, put your
Oh,
kid on
I
every
thought
single diet.
yeah. I mean,
um,
I will say I thought you
yeah.
meant just like anti-anxiety meds, which like have been very helpful for my brother. So I thought
Oh
you
yeah,
meant
yeah, yeah.
anti-psychiatry.
No, 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 no. Meds are great. Take meds. Good meds. I mean like the sort of pseudoscience alternative medicine solutions where you're sort
Yeah.
of grasping at straws of non-empirically tested non-Western medicine. I get it. I wouldn't encourage anyone to do it, but like I understand where you're like, what if this does help? Like, what if there's a 2% chance and I didn't take it and that 2% comes true? Like, what if? It's like a big thing. And like we're just going over some cases. There are other cases that I've talked about on previous episodes. 14C erosion is a big one. So 14C are the um, charities that hire disabled people to do various jobs that they're capable of doing with a job coach. They pay them less than minimum wage. People with ASD1 hear that and they go, they are trying to exploit us. Imagine if I got paid less than minimum wage. And there's one example of like a guy who used to be in 14C employment and is now a lawyer. There's like one example of that, right? Like this is not a common thing. And this is one of those like, oh, yeah, shouldn't have been there. That was an inappropriate assignment of things. These things will always happen. But at the same time, like this is not evil capitalists getting autistic people to make iPhones in their sweatshops. This is like a jobs program where you have a social worker basically helping people shred paper. That's what this is. And they get to hang out with their friends.
Which, especially for
Like,
people with ASD2, can be really meaningful and provide meaning. There was a time where this is a story about my aunt who has pretty severe cerebral palsy as well as an intellectual disability. And so she's always lived with my parents. Well, she started living with my parents. My parents got married, and she has a job like this. She works at a local school, part-time job, but she's pretty intellectually disabled, and it's mostly something nice, which our Catholic local school like lets her do, and she gets to hang out with the teachers, and they call her Miss Rose, and it's a big source of satisfaction for her. One time I was visiting home, and I had left like a coat on a sofa, and she turned to me, and she was after she hung up my coat for me, and then she turned to me and she said, "I can't be cleaning up after you all the time. I have a job." So I just think that like it shows that like these things are really actually important for disabled people, and it's actually really like helpful for them to have that place where they can go, and it gives them like a great deal of meaning in their lives.
yes. And when you go on ASAN's website and you look at their position on 14C, it's like, this is wage exploitation. These people are being taken advantage of. We need to destroy these programs. And like, keep in mind, these programs would not exist. The alternative to 14C is not full paid equal employment. The alternative to 14C is staying at home.
Yeah, because a lot of these people are not qualified for full paid equal employment. It's frankly it's a nice thing to do for this person.
And the programs themselves have something built into them where they do regular checks. Like it's a regulatory compliance thing where every like 6 months or every year you have a person who goes through and be like, do you want to try full-time employment, or are you able to? A lot of people who do try full-time employment end up leaving it and going back to their 14C job because they want to work with their friends. This is not how ASAN characterizes it. ASAN characterizes it as if these people are all ASD1s and being underemployed when they could be properly employed. And it's just like, this screws them over. There are other like really major serious issues with things like care facilities and access to care facilities and advocates wanting to shut down care facilities and, oh no, institutionalization and things like that. And it's like, yeah, institutionalization was bad. Institutionalization was bad because of understaffing and abuse and all sorts of like really genuinely terrible things. We should deal with those issues, but also let's be realistic here. Not every care facility is like abusive. Sometimes these things are fine. And there are like thousands of examples of people assuming that these are essentially people with ASD1 in these facilities, and that if I was in that facility, it would be miserable for me. Therefore, we should shut these down and return these people into individualized, independent living. And like, I could probably go on for the next 3 hours of examples of all of these things where it's basically like the central theme is the needs of people with ASD3 get overlooked for the desires of the people with ASD1. And I think this happens because of what I call like three reasons: movement inertia, misunderstanding of the autism spectrum, and just improper analogies and improper assumptions. So, like movement inertia, I want to emphasize people in ASAN are not evil. They do not hate people with ASD3. They legitimately think they are doing the right thing. It is wrong to interpret this as malice. This is just what happens in activism. So this is like intersectional feminism became a thing. Why did intersectional feminism become a thing? Because women from marginalized groups felt like their concerns were not being reflected by the majority white women who had most of the power and status. And so they said, we need to advocate for ourselves. All the intersectional concerns that we have in modern activism are because groups have looked at them and said, look, we are not actually being represented by the majority. This happens everywhere. Why would it not happen in autism? The effect is present in every activist movement because this is sort of naturally what happens. The people with the most power, the most privilege, and the most ability to articulate and maneuver in society are the ones who will speak for the movement. Every single movement, no matter what, no matter how well intentioned, will have the tendency to amplify its most competent, palatable, and privileged voices. The autism advocacy movement is no exception. People will fervently deny this. They will say, we center the voices of the most marginalized. It's not true. It's not true for many reasons, and one of the reasons is the most marginalized in our community literally can't talk. Like, literally cannot talk. And like there, you just can't advocate for these people advocating for yourself. It just doesn't work like that. And it's just way easier to focus on the most privileged people in your group. And the most privileged and the least privileged people in the group literally cannot advocate for themselves. The people who advocate for them are their parents, who then get attacked for not actually being part of the movement, even though a lot of them are, but we won't touch that. Do not, I say again, do not suggest to a very caustic and obsessive woman who is not diagnosed with autism that she might be a candidate for ASD1 when she has an ASD3 child. Listeners, do not make the mistakes I have made.
Or I will say sibling, as I would have to
Yes.
say many such cases. I was assessed for ADHD when I was 14. This was over, gosh, this is 15 years ago now. So, and the assessor was like, I strongly recommend Marie be assessed for Asperger's disorder. I strongly suspect a neurodevelopmental disability. And I was just, I was like, I'm not like my brother. Like, this is obviously like, this person is stupid and wrong. And I also like was kind of scared. What if it was true? So I was like, you can't get it if you're not tested, which is very silly.
Yes. um, Many such cases. There is, I have found, just like an extreme resistance of very obviously autistic family members of profoundly autistic people to get diagnosed because they're like, no, I don't have this. And because they know what it's like, they know what profound autism is like, and they're like, this obviously isn't me. This is absurd to
It's like
suggest it's me.
the time that my little sister, someone when she was a child, someone told her that she was special, and that was the word that we used for my brother, and so she burst into tears.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I think a real problem with the autism self advocacy movement is the vast majority of us only interact with other people who have ASD1. We mostly talk to other people who are online. Who's online? People with ASD1. Sure, people with ASD2 and 3 are also online, not in the same way ASD1 people are. Like, it's just, if you have a group of autistic friends, they're all ASD1s. And so your perception of what autism is people with ASD1 and not a whole lot of people with ASD3. It gets a bit delusional. Like, I have had many people who have ASD1, very obviously have ASD1, who say, I was diagnosed with ASD1, but most days I'm probably a 2 or a 3. This is an
What?
objectively insane thing to say. No one who has any experience with ASD2 or 3 would say that. So I have had people tell me
I'm
they
sorry.
are
When I saw that in
ASD2.
the notes earlier,
Yeah.
I was shocked. But it's just funny to me. Like
Yeah.
what?
No, and I'm just like, no, you're like, you have been misled as to what that means. You are not in that same category. You are having executive dysfunction. You are having difficulty processing. You are having a bad day. You are not ASD2 or 3. Please, let's be serious. I've had a person say they were ASD2 when they had completed a PhD and then got evaluated with their children. They had 2 kids. It's like, okay, let's be clear. You have 2 kids, you have a husband, you are still married,
Yeah.
you have a PhD in an advanced field. I
If it's
have met
based on
people with
support
ASD2.
needs, it's not.
To do that, you do not have high support needs. I'm not saying people with ASD2 can't go to university. Some of them probably can. I'm
I will
saying
say
if you get a
I've met people who
PhD,
have, but they tend to be very underemployed. I knew someone who
yes,
graduated, but now is working. They live with their parents,
yeah,
and they work at a grocery store.
yep. I know a few people with ASD2 who have done some university courses or who have done college courses. I don't know any who have got a full degree yet. I'm sure they exist. If you crack on at it enough, I'm sure you can eventually get there. I've not met any. You did a PhD before you, as an undiagnosed autistic person,
Oh no,
you
no,
do
no,
not have
no,
ASD2.
no way,
If you were not
no way.
diagnosed until your kids were diagnosed, you do not have ASD2. That is a simple fact, right? You don't fly under the radar like that.
No,
Get a PhD, get married, and have 2 kids. That is not what ASD2 is. Meet people with ASD2. I've met many who have ASD2. They are not undiagnosed. No one would leave them undiagnosed. Everyone immediately notices something. I don't know what else to say. But these statements could only be said by someone who has no exposure to these people. Like, many people with ASD1 simply do not understand profound mental impairment. And they'll say things like, look, you can't just take a person's tested IQ. There are all sorts of problems with tested IQ because of all this issue and this issue. And like, I can fully grasp all these problems, right? I can fully take in every single critique of IQ tests and how they are flawed. And like IQ tests that use time for how fast you answer questions when you have a motor delay. Absolutely. That will affect your results. That is a bad measure. You should not use that. And you can give every single critique of tested IQ that you want, but also talk to a person with ASD3 for an hour. Just hang out with them for an hour. Hang out with them for more than that, maybe. And you will start to realize that, like, okay, all those critiques of tested IQ can be valid, but also, like, they still have a profound intellectual disability. Like, again, I have spent the time. I have there's a challenge called the 1 hour challenge that a lot of parents with profoundly autistic children will talk about, where they'll talk to autism advocates and they'll say, how about you try the 1 hour challenge? Just come hang out with me and my kid for an hour. And let's see, after that hour, do you think they can fully advocate for themselves? Amy Lutz actually did this with a very famous autism activist named John Elder Robison. Um, and John Elder Robison made some fairly offensive comments about Amy's son. And she decided to take the high road and said, how about you come spend some time with him? And after that, see if you think he can, make his own care decisions. And at the end of the hour, he's like, okay, you're right. Like, this obviously, we can't, yeah. And talk to anyone who has contact with ASD3. A lot of people with ASD1 just don't have any, and they have wildly optimistic and wildly uncharacteristic ideas of what their capacities and capabilities are. And any attempt to talk about it plainly will be met with accusations of ableism. When it's like, this isn't ableism, this is a literal description of reality. Like, it is not ableism to describe someone who is paralyzed as being paralyzed. It is just a statement of fact. and this
I
is the
actually
same thing with
worry.
ASD3.
I actually do worry that, like, I think that a lot of people recognize when we're in public that my brother is disabled, and there has been a change in over my lifetime. I've seen it, of people have grown kinder to my family. And it's not to say that people were always cruel before. People actually have generally been kind. That's a good thing, and should be celebrated. But people have become even kinder over time because they understand that it's tough. People tend to understand that it's hard. But I worry that in cases where, my brother might be causing like problems in public, or like, God forbid, like he's lost or something, or, something is happening of that. And people say, what's wrong? And we say he's autistic. What comes to mind is Sheldon Cooper. And so there's a lack of understanding, and a kind of understanding and a sort of grace that people with profound autism and their caregivers so desperately need.
Yeah, and I think many people with ASD1 simply just have no conception of what people with ASD3's lives are like. And I think that drives a lot of this. I think a lot of people with ASD1 basically say people with ASD3 are essentially the same as us. They just have more needs. I have had many people with ASD1 in my time make statements like, I know this kid better than their parent does because I have autism, even though I have never met them. This is a crazy thing to say, that a, a profoundly autistic person better than their caregiver because you also have autism, or that you can understand their experiences better than their parent.
It's also so
It's,
odd because one of the characteristics of autism is that the way it can present in extremely like varied ways. So
yeah,
honestly, like I would even maybe say that about like ASD1 people in a way. Like I don't like there's so many different flavors of it too.
yeah, exactly. Like, I've been doing autism research for this long, and I'm like, there are some autistic people, I'm like, I can model what's going on, but I cannot relate to what's going on at all
Yeah,
right there.
you've got like the neurodiverse, autistic woke autistic people, and you've got like the ones who don't think women should vote and like post a
Yes.
lot of like really cringy AI memes and
Those
about
ones
like
actually have
I
a
don't
lot
know.
in common, but they don't like hearing that. But that's actually a very similar autism type. It's just they got socially directed in different ways. Yeah, like, it is. If you had the experiences of Ari Neiman in his special ed school, I can completely understand why you would want to change that. The difficulty is there were people in Ari's school for whom that school was developmentally appropriate, right?
Yeah.
If there were people for whom it was developmentally inappropriate, there were also people for whom it was appropriate.
I will just say this, like I graduated from Dartmouth College. My brother cannot read. These are different cases. I should not have been kept from attending Dartmouth due to my issues. That would have been a profound loss for me. And I can imagine why someone who maybe would have had that potential and would have wanted to have that experience and was kept from it unfairly, why they would be angry about this. I understand that. I mean, I loved college, honestly. I had a great time in college in terms of like intellectually, it was a great time. I got to like think and read and write about the things that I wanted to read and write and think about, which was really nice. And I also, as you can probably imagine, there were a lot of nerds there. That was fun too.
Yes.
But somebody like my brother, that's not something that would ever, it's just completely different cases.
Yeah, and like, the final thing is just, I think a lot of autistic people saw what happened in other civil rights movements, like the gay rights movement and the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movements, and they went, okay, we need to model ourselves after that. Like, the disability rights movement passing the ADA, massive. The ADA is great. right? I think the ADA is a very good piece of legislation. Does it have flaws? Sure, everything has flaws, but like in general, having a protection for people who have disabilities, like that's awesome. Like it was initially founded for people with physical disabilities and wounded veterans. That is, they could all advocate for themselves. Autism isn't like that. Autism is a broad spectrum, and the problem is like 28% of the population has a profound intellectual disability. That's so 28% of the autistic population is the approximate number of us who have profound autism. Profound autism means you have a low tested IQ, meaning you cannot do many of the cognitive tasks that most people can do. A further 32% of autistic people need a responsible adult to take care of them to live. So, that's a large portion of the autism spectrum, some of whom can advocate for themselves, many of whom cannot. And this is not an analogous situation to the civil rights movement. It is not an analogous situation to the women's movement. It is not an analogous situation to people with physical disabilities in the ADA.
As a radical feminist, I will say it's not
Yeah.
an analogous situation.
Yeah, it is wildly not analogous.
Yeah.
Because in these populations, you did not have 28% who literally could not advocate for themselves. Like, if
Yeah.
28% of the population that you were supposedly speaking for could not even be surveyed, like, this doesn't make sense. And it's, I get this is great, but we need to acknowledge that, yeah, the gay rights movement was great, achieved civil liberties for gay people. But also, autism isn't being gay. Yeah, there is some overlap, I'll say, but like bad analogy. Like that's it, right? Like it is not a universally applicable situation. There are a huge amount of us where if you're one gay person and a whole bunch of other gay people want the right to get married, you can all band together and put aside your differences and the wide diversity inside you and advocate for your own single common interest. There is no single common interest within the autism spectrum.
I will also
And
say,
so,
actually, going off that, there was a minority within the gay rights movement which did not want marriage
correct.
because they
Yeah.
thought marriage, yes, marriage itself was oppressive. But however, it was the general thought of the other gay people who didn't want marriage that, like, by having marriage as an option, we're not actually taking anything away from them. And that's actually quite different if you think about it from in terms of like there are trade-offs here. This is zero sum. This isn't like saying like you actually are taking away resources from people who are very vulnerable. Like this is a zero sum thing, I'm afraid.
Like whether you like it or not, the split has already happened. Like autism has already been split. It was split with the Lancet communicate or it was split with the Lancet Commission in 2021, where they came up with the term profound autism. You might not like that the split is here, but they literally have pushed it already. The split is upon us whether we like it or not. And at this point I just think we should admit that merging it, we ran the experiment for 12 years. We have the data on what happened, and I think mistakes were made. Sure, like there were absolutely great gains for people with ASD1, without a doubt. People with ASD1 absolutely benefited from it. It was great for us. And it was a cost paid mostly by people with ASD3, which sucks so hard. It wasn't intentionally done to them. We didn't think this would happen. I think we should acknowledge that it did and that this is how it happened. And I
So now you're
just,
doing your penance.
yeah. Well, like, pretty
I'm
much. Like,
joking. I'm joking.
no, like, I sort of see this, like, these episodes, and people are like, why do you keep talking about this? It's like, because I spent a lot of time on the ASD1 advocacy side, and I don't think I spent that time wisely. right? Like, I think we made mistakes, and I made mistakes as being part of that, and we should acknowledge that we did. And like, this isn't a call to like, let's go back to the year 2000 where people with ASD1 were just getting absolutely screwed, right? Like, let's not do that. That was bad. I think we've established how horrible it was for us. I don't think we should go back to that. But like, there's just like, there's got to be a different way moving forward. And so like, what is my solution? Like, I normally try to be neutral on here, but like, I mean, and give both sides, but I think the solution is to keep ASD as a broad spectrum condition, kind of like you have cancer or blindness or amputation, or just like these conditions that everyone goes, yeah, there is a difference between someone
Skin
who is
cancer and
missing.
having to
Yeah,
have radiation and chemotherapy for lung
yeah,
cancer or something.
yeah. There's a difference between having your hand missing and having all four limbs missing. We all describe that as amputation, but we also like recognize this is just a very broad category, and that we shouldn't talk about amputees as a single like a single contiguous category that all has the same problems. I think we should acknowledge that there are very significant differences between the types of ASDs that we have here. Sure, there are borders. Like we said, the borders are porous. There is a sorting and splitting issue. But let's just be honest that the median ASD1, ASD2, and ASD3 are very, very different from each other. They share commonalities, but they have differences. I think support needs language has too many limitations. I don't think it adequately captures what's going on. And I think it just sort of, you need to differentiate between people who have the ability to self-advocate, to self-direct care, to live independently. Like, a quadriplegic has very high support needs, but they can direct their own self-care. So like, what does high support needs mean for a quadriplegic? They have a fully intact mind, right? They can tell you what they want. They can clearly articulate things. They could write a book. They can do all sorts of things. But they have high support needs because they don't have any limbs, or they can't move their limbs or whatever. Stephen Hawking has high support needs. Stephen Hawking, however, should not be in the same category as someone who cannot conceptualize what a city is. And so
I
I
don't even
think,
think I should be in the same category as Stephen
I mean, he's dead.
Hawking.
He's dead. So, he's in a very different category from everyone. He is in the category of with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
We're universalists on this podcast.
Well, hopeful for me, otherwise I'm doing heresy,
Okay.
but hopeful
Yes.
universalist.
Yes, we are both hopeful universalists. We hope Stephen Hawking is in heaven.
We are
Anyway,
commanded to hope.
yes. Anyway, I just think that we need to make hard distinctions between these. My solution would be to keep ASD as a broad spectrum, and then give distinctive names to the like ASD 1, 2, and 3. Give them completely different names. So ASD 1, instead of calling it ASD 1, call it like, I don't know. I've jokingly suggested Elon Greta syndrome, right? You know, take two famous people that no one wants to be associated with on either side of the political pole. Elon Greta syndrome. I don't care. Just give it a name so that when we talk about this, we can only talk about this. When we direct research money, you're only directing it there. And
Yeah.
have like clearly defined things that put you in this category. I think the categories should be fail down instead of fail up, meaning that like when these things are being categorized, you should err on the side of a more severe categorization than a less severe categorization to like deal with the edge sorting problem, because it's always better to be in the more severe than in the less severe when it comes to funding and insurance and things like that. But just give them names so that we can disambiguate them easily. And let's stop talking about ASD as the sort of, or let's stop talking about autism as the sort of thing that encompasses all of us, but be a lot more specific and say ASD1 or ASD2 or 3 or whatever we name them. I think we also need to acknowledge that gatekeeping is probably going to be necessary in this, and just say that, like,
Yeah.
we tried the open thing. The open thing has issues. Another thing that I'm very passionate about is I think we need to revive broad autism phenotype. Have an ASD
Oh,
0
yeah.
that we can use as like the meme version of autism. So, right now autism is a meme and everyone jokes about it. I think we should try to make BAP that. So like, yeah, he's got BAP. Or, they're like, I have a touch of the tism. It's like, yes, let's give that a name
A
and
splash of
not make it.
Asperger's, if you will.
Yeah, yes. I don't think we should. I don't think we should revive the term Asperger. I think.
No,
I think
neither
that
do
that
I.
man has a little too much blood on his hands.
Yeah.
However, just give it something. I do think we should acknowledge ASD 0 or broad autism phenotype, and give it a catchy name and use that as the thing to be like, he's a little off, so that people with if you have no support needs, but you're a little off, we can still give you something
Yeah.
to
I like to think of
self-describe,
my
because I
dad,
think
who
that
is
would be
not,
helpful.
I don't think my dad is autistic, broad autism phenotype. He was working from home before it was cool, homeschooled his kids. It's like when I see him like moving his rice onto a different plate so that the sauce won't touch the rice, it's like, I see what you are. but
I know you're sent.
I
Yes.
would say this is, again, broad autism phenotype. He's not. He would not qualify, nor he would. I don't think I don't think anyone would ever say he would not. I don't think anyone would ever say that he is ASD1. But just, it actually can be helpful for getting to like relate to people, and it's also something which, like, when my mom realized that about my dad, like, I know it made their marriage better. So it's also like there's the meme version, but like it can be a good thing too.
Yes. I'm very serious about. I think we need to revive broad autism phenotype. Any final questions before we cap off this nearly 3 hour long podcast?
I was about to say 3 hours, and no, just thank you for having me on again. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, John.
Yes.
Um,
We will need to have you on for another episode to talk about Sherman tanks and Horatio Nelson.
oh yeah.
All right. Cool. I'll stop it here.